Welcome back to the Creation Reformation YouTube channel. This is Jake Ramgren, and as I promised in a previous video, I'm going to be breaking down this paper called Cause of Cambrian Explosion, Terrestrial or Cosmic. So thank you for joining me. It's going to be a long one this time. Took quite some time to film and put together, so let's just dive right into it. So my previous presentation, you can find a shorter version of this. It's not exactly a short video, but it's shorter and kind of gives you the overview of what this paper is arguing and all the parts of it. And I kind of summarize that in a nice PowerPoint format. No special slideshow today, nothing fancy, just looking at this scientific paper, reading through it, and explaining what it means. So we're not going to read everything word for word. We are going to break it down in reasonable depth. So thanks for joining me, and hope you're in it for the long haul, and you'll stick with me till the end, and you'll have a pretty good in-depth grasp on this paper. So why am I spending so much time on this particular scientific paper? Well, this paper, as I said, is called Cause of Cambrian Explosion, Terrestrial or Cosmic. And if you've seen my last video on this, then you know that the paper is proposing that there are organisms that are living among us that have been seeded on Earth from elsewhere in the universe. In fact, that might be the origin of where all living things come from. So this paper proposes a paradigm shift, which is things that happen in science where people completely shift their perspective on something and they start looking at all of nature, all of science in a new perspective. So we've had a few paradigm shifts before. We've had a paradigm shift from, if you want to go back to medieval Europe, we had a paradigm shift from geocentrism, or the Earth being in the center of the solar system, to heliocentrism, or the sun being in the center of the solar system. We've had the Darwinian shift, where people stopped looking at organisms as special creations of God in their present form and actually started looking at organisms as constantly evolving and changing. So these were not necessarily new, or not always. Paradigm shifts are not always new discoveries, but very often they're actually scientists just looking at things that have already been discovered and explaining them in a new way and shifting the focus. So these scientists who are the author of this paper, there are 33 of them, are proposing a paradigm shift where instead of looking at the origin of life and all of evolution through the perspective of just terrestrial processes, they want to expand and look at all of life as part of a cosmic model where you actually take into account other planets and the whole galaxy and maybe even beyond the galaxy. They want a cosmic model of evolution, not just a terrestrial model of evolution. And in their minds, over the course of the last few hundred millions of years, ever since Earth became habitable for life, there have been living organisms that have survived dropping here from outer space on comets or other extraplanetary debris that land and seed the life on here. Now, life had been seeded on Earth even before the world was habitable, but obviously life couldn't survive because the globe wasn't habitable. So the bacteria or whatever organisms that arrived here on comets, according to this idea, would have died off. But as soon as the conditions for life became favorable, then the organisms that are being pelted onto Earth basically start surviving and reproducing. And that's kind of how life was seeded on Earth. And they bring some very interesting arguments to the table in terms of the evolutionary model. So they're arguing for a paradigm shift that argues in favor of extraterrestrial life being the origin of living things that eventually evolved into what we have today. And they're going to use several different lines of argumentation. And the reason I keep going back to this paper is because some of their arguments sound just like young Earth creationist talking points in terms of criticizing the mainstream paradigm that is evolution. And now on my channel, I've actually spoken pretty favorably about the theory of evolution for a creationist. I think it's a pretty good model and a pretty good theory, and that explains a lot of the things that we see today. But there are reasons why I don't actually accept it, and those are largely theological and philosophical. But I'm not going to dive into that because today I'm actually going to dive into scientific arguments that challenge the mainstream neo-Darwinian paradigm. And those arguments are not coming from intelligent design advocates. They're not coming from young Earth creationists. They are coming from 33 professional scientists from a diverse range of backgrounds in scientific fields of expertise. And they have come together to write a big paper that basically challenges current evolution theory and proposes an alternative, which is, of course, extraterrestrial evolution. So thank you for joining me today on a longer video that is still focused on this paper. And welcome back to the Creation Reformation YouTube channel. So let's start off by looking at the abstract, which if you've ever read a science paper or taken a class in science, you know that an abstract is the paragraph at the beginning of a scientific paper that basically summarizes the research you're about to read. So this is going to be them laying out their main argument. This is the whole thing summarized. Now, if you look down at the contents, there are 19 sections in this paper, from the purpose to introduction to then a bunch of different lines of reasoning. So there are 19 parts, but they're all going to be summarized in this abstract. So we're going to dive right in. They start with, we review the salient evidence consistent with or predicted by the Hoyle-Wickram, I keep looking up how to pronounce it and I still get it wrong, the Hoyle-Wickram thesis of cometary or cosmic biology. Much of this physical and biological evidence is multifactorial. One particular focus are the recent studies which date the emergence of the complex retroviruses of vertebrate lines at or just before the Cambrian explosion of about 500 million years ago. Such viruses are known to be plausibly associated with major evolutionary genomic processes. We believe this coincidence is not fortuitous, but is consistent with a key prediction of HW theory, whereby major extinction diversification evolutionary boundaries coincide with virus-bearing cometary bolide bombardment events. Okay, that's a pretty big mouthful to start off with. But basically, one of their lines of argumentation is focused on retroviruses. Retroviruses are basically viruses that, when they infect a cell, they don't just destroy the cell or kill it, but they actually alter and change around its DNA. And that can actually change some of its functions and some of its traits. It's thought to be a mechanism of evolution at the single cellular level. And even some in the extracellular level. So viruses basically get inside a cell and then they mess around with the DNA and they actually input new genetic information and they change the genome of the microscopic organism. And so they point out that there are retroviruses that are present during the Cambrian explosion, which I'll briefly say the Cambrian explosion is a very famous kind of part of paleontology. I'm no paleontologist, but I'm familiar with what the Cambrian explosion is, which is that about 500 million years ago in the conventional theory, there was this explosion of life where in the fossil record, most major groups of animals appear suddenly in the fossil record. Suddenly by evolutionary standards, meaning they all kind of appear within a 40 million year period of geological time. And they don't actually have evolutionary precursors or transitional forms before them. They just appear suddenly in the fossil record, pretty much complete organisms, and then go from there. And this has been a challenge for evolutionists to explain. Stephen Jay Gould famously tried to explain it with his idea called punctuated equilibrium, which I haven't really covered in depth before, but I have mentioned it a couple of times. Basically, their proposal and one of their arguments for their proposal is that during the Cambrian explosion, there were already retroviruses that were pretty good at changing DNA that were present on Earth when the Cambrian explosion happened. And so the idea is that the retroviruses were deposited on Earth from outside of the Earth. And so when organisms and then they could generate rapid evolution that happened during the Cambrian explosion, because many different creatures are evolving and most major groups of animals evolve in this relatively short time span. And retroviruses might be responsible for that. So retroviruses from outer space caused the Cambrian explosion to happen in an evolutionarily short period of time. So that's basically what they're proposing. They haven't, and so they propose this in this last sentence that I read. The extinction, diversification, evolutionary boundaries. That means parts in the fossil record where there are big extinction events and then rapid diversification events, which in evolutionary terms coincide a lot. There's a big extinction event, and then immediately afterwards, there's a rapid evolution diversification event. Another one of those is the asteroid that hit 66 million years ago in the conventional timeline, wiped out the dinosaurs, big extinction event, and then immediately afterwards, there's a rapid diversification of the mammals. Well, they identify there were some extinction and diversification events in the Cambrian era, And this is due to a virus-bearing cometary bolide bombardment events. So comets bombarding the Earth from outer space, carrying on these comets extraterrestrial viruses that then generate rapid diversification and extinction events. That's what's being proposed here. And then they go on because there's more. A second focus is the remarkable evolution of intelligent complexity in cephalopods, culminating in the emergence of the octopus. So their first line of reasoning is retroviruses during the Cambrian explosion that drive diversification. Their second argument is the intelligent complexity of cephalopods. Cephalopods are a group of organisms, including the octopus, the squid, the nautilus, and others. The cuttlefish, another one. That's my favorite one. I don't know why I forgot it just then. But the cephalopods are so complex, and yet they appear so early on the fossil record that their proposal is that cephalopods have been directly seeded on Earth from outer space, or have been mutated by retroviruses. And that's why they're so complex, even though they're well before any of the really complex organisms, right? They appear pretty low in the fossil record. And so that's their second line of argumentation is current evolutionary thinking can't explain the cephalopods. It can't explain how complex they are. They can't explain their phylogenetics or how they are related to other organisms. They can't even explain how these organisms are related to each other. And so I'm getting ahead of myself there. That's later on in the paper. We'll get to that, but let's keep going. A third focus concerns the microorganism fossil evidence contained within meteorites, as well as the detection in the upper atmosphere of apparent incoming life-bearing particles from space. So basically, their next argument comes from outside of the Earth, where they see evidence of microorganisms contained in meteorites. So they've found meteorites, according to this paper, that have evidence that microorganisms were there. There are fossils of microorganisms on meteorites. And they've also found them in our atmosphere, up in our atmosphere. Life-bearing particles that seem to have come from space. So, because of these three general lines of reasoning, in our view, the totality of the multifactorial data and critical analyses assembled by Fred Hoyle and Wickramasinghe and their many colleagues since the 1960s leads to a very plausible conclusion. Life may have been seeded here on Earth by life-bearing comets as soon as conditions on Earth allowed it to flourish, which is about 4.1 billion years ago, and living organisms such as space-resistant and space-hardy bacteria, viruses, more complex eukaryotic cells, fertilized ova, and seeds have been continuously delivered ever since to Earth, so being one important driver of further terrestrial evolution, which has resulted in considerable genetic diversity and which has led to the emergence of mankind. I hope that's the longest sentence in this paper because that was a doozy. But their proposal, their conclusion, because of these three lines of evidence, and also because we know of organisms that can survive the vacuum of space that are living here on Earth, we think, according to these 33 scientists, that life has been seeded on Earth constantly by life-bearing comets. We've been bombarded with living organisms for the last billions and billions of years, and they've only started thriving on Earth once conditions on Earth became livable. So that's the proposal, and now they're going to go through 19 lines of arguments, including introduction and purpose of the article, that are going to back up this abstract. So hopefully you're with me so far. You understand the goal of the paper and the basically the research that they're doing, and they're compiling these arguments from multiple different fields of science. All these 33 scientists have different backgrounds, different fields of expertise. And so what we're basically going to do here is just dive right in and see all the lines of argumentation that they're going to use to demonstrate their theory. So we'll start with number one, the purpose of the article. We're going to go through all 19. So buckle up. We're going to be here for a while. Number one, the purpose of the article. This review article is intended to represent, in the main, the collective knowledge and wisdom of over 30 scientists and scholars across many disciplines of the physical and biological sciences. We review much of the key experimental and observational data gathered over the past 60 years, consistent with or predicted by the Hoyle-Wickramasinghe thesis of cometary biology. I practiced that last name over and over again, and I'm still probably getting it wrong, but these The Hoyle, Walker, Masinge basically were the guys who first proposed a truly scientific um, hypothesis that life came from outer space. They basically prove that there are organic materials, that the parts that make up life, that you can find elsewhere in the solar system, not just on Earth. So they proposed that living things evolved elsewhere before being deposited on Earth. Okay, this does get a little interesting here, which is why I'm actually reading their introduction or their purpose of the article section, because there are some interesting things to dissect here. They go on to say, we are acutely aware that mainstream thinking on the origin and further evolution of life on Earth is anchored firmly in the terrestrial paradigm. So this happens over and over again in science. When someone knows that they're proposing something controversial or different or wild, they mention it. They don't just propose it. They say, I know what I'm doing is proposing something crazy. And Copernicus, in his book on the revolutions of heavenly spheres, which is one of the most influential scientific books in history, he opened with basically speaking to the leadership of his day. I forget who it was addressed to, but it was a pope. I think he talks to the pope and whoever the pope was in his day, and he basically says, "I know what I'm saying is crazy, and lots of people um, are going to just shut me down immediately and not hear out my arguments." But and he's like, he even says, "I don't want to write a book about this. I really just want to go word of mouth so I can defend my ideas person to person." But he compiled all his arguments into a volume for kind of ease, so people can see his arguments easily. So if anybody's actually seeking answers, they'll pick up his book and read it. And it's kind of a fascinating approach, right? Anybody who knows that they're revolutionizing a worldview, they say it in their work. They don't just propose it and act like it's true. They say, look, I know I'm going off the beaten path here. And that's what these guys are doing too. They are acutely aware that mainstream thinking is purely terrestrial. Our aim here is to facilitate further discussion in the biophysical, biomedical, and evolutionary science communities in the quite different HW cosmic origins viewpoint, which better handles, in our opinion, a wider range of physical, astrophysical, biological, and biophysical facts, often quite inexplicable, if not contradictory, under the dominant terrestrial neo-Darwinian paradigm. Okay, and there's the part where this is why I'm reviewing this paper from a creationist perspective, because a lot of their reasons for accepting this idea of panspermia, which is the theory they're proposing, is that their reasons for accepting that is that there are lots of facts that they think are contradictory to the current Darwinian paradigm. So current evolution theory does not explain or even contradicts some lines of evidence. And you'll see that some of these lines of evidence are pretty much exactly what creationists argue. It's like creationist talking points, and that's why I'm breaking down this paper. And I have 2 long videos about it in total now, and that's the reason why. Because as creationists, this should be very interesting to us because this is a critique of evolution from professional evolutionists. Further, if some readers are hoping to read a disquisition based on population genetics type analyses, as one reviewer has put it, analyses of evolutionary rates, examples of appearance of new genes with no homology to old ones, etc., they will be mostly disappointed. So now they're kind of getting into this is what this paper isn't. Although some genetic features from recent data in the octopus and other cephalopods provide challenging examples to conventional evolutionary theory, but that is not the main thrust of the review. So basically, they're just pointing out they're not going to dive into evolutionary genetics, with the exception of pointing to cephalopods and how they don't fit the evolutionary paradigm. But they're not going to be breaking down. They're not going to be breaking down the theory of evolution in depth here. They're just going to be pointing towards some lines of evidence that contradict the theory of evolution, and they're going to replace it with extraterrestrial origins. So this might not be the right time to say this, but while I'm reading this now, a thought kind of pops in my head that if this paper actually gains some ground, and it's been 7 years since it was published, just about, so there's been some time, but if it does actually garner some interest, and if the theory of evolution actually itself evolves to basically say that life came from outer space, I really wonder what the theistic evolutionists would have to say to that. Because sure, sure they can accept evolution in the context of biblical creation, and they kind of put the two together. But Scripture is also very clear that life was made on Earth, And so I anticipate maybe if the challenges presented in this paper are serious and legitimate and are challenging to evolutionists, and more evolutionists will say, okay, well, maybe life did come from outer space. I'm very curious to think how the theistic evolutionists would respond to that. Will they accept that life could have come about from outer space, which seems even more contradictory to scripture? Or will they actually put their foot down and say, no, I think living things evolved on Earth and kept things terrestrial? Like, will there be a split there? Something to think about. Okay, they do keep going here, but I'm going to have to skip because I can't go through this whole paper word for word. But they do talk about how their writing style is a little more easier to read than most scientific papers, only just because they want to communicate their theory clearly so that no one misunderstands them and they're being more straightforward. So they're gonna talk a little bit more casually. It's a well-written paper, but it's not just thick scientific jargon that like a layperson could understand. It's a good paper to make a video about because I can read it and you can follow along and probably follow what it's saying without being expert in this subject. And so then they talk about how they're looking at phylogenetic data, which actually puts retroviruses at or before the Cambrian explosion, and again implying that retroviruses are responsible for creating biodiversity in the Cambrian period. Okay, so then it does get interesting down here. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit. Let's cover the last couple paragraphs and then we'll move on to section 2. In our considered view, the totality of the multifactorial data and critical analyses assembled by Fred Hoyle and Wickramasinghe, how many times are going to make me say that last name, and their many colleagues leads to the bare minimum yet plausible scientific conclusion that life was seeded here on Earth by life-bearing comets as soon as conditions on Earth allowed it to flourish. Living organisms such as space-resistant and space-hardy bacteria, viruses, and eukaryotic cells, and organisms such as tardigrades, perhaps even fertilized ova and plant seeds, may have been continuously delivered ever since to Earth, helping to drive further the progress of terrestrial biological evolution. And this process has been called panspermia even since the 1800s. So they're not the first ones to propose life came from outer space. There is another scientific paper that talks about the whole history of panspermia, talks about how even ancient civilizations thought that life came from beyond the atmosphere. Not in a very scientific view, but in a very spiritual view. The firmament that the ancient cultures believed in. They believed that life was seeded from elsewhere and came down onto Earth. And I won't actually review that paper because it gets really, really inappropriate because, well, let's just say it's called panspermia for a reason. And that ancient cultures that believed it really put the sperm in panspermia. And that's all I'm going to say about that. So it's very, very gross. There's hieroglyphs of Greek gods, and it's not pretty. So I'm not going to dwell on that. I'm going to move right along. But it is, I'm not sure where they actually make this point, but I've read this paper and I know they do make the point at some point. But it is interesting that that organisms on Earth can survive outer space. So tardigrades can survive outer space, bacterial spores can survive in outer space, and plenty of other organisms, and plant seeds may even be able to. And if life did not, if you're an evolutionist, you believe all of evolution, and life on Earth is able to survive outer space, that's weird. That's it. That's a weird thing. If organisms evolved terrestrially, right? Why in the world would they evolve the ability to survive in outer space? There's no reason to do that. There's no organisms that are leaving the Earth to survive elsewhere. So why would there be organisms that have adapted for the ability to live in the harsh conditions of space, those conditions which are nowhere on Earth? You can't find a place on Earth that matches the conditions of space. So why would an organism evolve to survive in space? Doesn't make any sense. What does make sense is if life did evolve from outer space or come from outer space, and then as things evolved across Earth, most things lose the ability to survive in outer space because they're evolving to conditions on Earth. And some organisms just maintain that ability. They maintain the genetic information and the features that allowed them to come to Earth from outer space, and and while most of them lose that ability, which we see all the time in nature. We see organisms adapt and change to fit new environments, and that often comes at a cost. They lose the genetic ability to basically live in the place that they lived in before. So over time, they adapt and change and, yes, evolve into a new area, and they lose the ability to live in the old area they lived in. So it is curious that some organisms can survive in outer space. Now, if you believe these creatures were divinely created in their created kinds, it's not crazy to think that some of them just have this really cool ability to, you could kick it out into outer space and it would survive. That's cool to think of. God created it to do that. That's neat. It's not contrary to anything. It's allowed in that worldview, but it's also a prediction of the panspermia advocates and a weird thing for the terrestrial evolution advocates. So something to think about. Okay. They continue with the paradigm shift to this critical viewpoint. And by the way, I just skipped over a paragraph that talks about how many planets could house life. So statistically speaking, there's probably planets out there that could house living organisms. And so they put that in there as well as kind of a point to make. But now they say the paradigm shift to this critical viewpoint, whilst underway, so according to them, this idea is gaining traction, is by no means complete, yet we believe the historical moment has now arrived for a comprehensive and cross-disciplinary review of much of the relevant evidence, which this paper endeavors to represent. There are many and far-reaching consequences of this new scientific awareness, which we believe would be the privilege of future generations to explore. So this paper's goal is just to show you an overview of all the lines of evidence for panspermia, and then now they get it on more people's radar, and then they encourage more people to research these ideas on their own in the future. So it's just a review. It's a review of all types of evidence, and that's why it's a long paper. That's why it's cross-disciplinary. That's why there are 33 scientists on this paper. So, all right, we are one section in out of 19, 1/19 of the way. And some of them are longer, some of them are shorter. So let's just keep going. All right, introductory remarks. Now, this last part was the purpose of the article, and now we're on to introductory remarks. That kind of feels like the same thing, but okay. The Aristotelian paradigm of the spontaneous generation of life, the idea the simplest life forms emerge spontaneously on Earth, which is basically the spontaneous generation, has survived in one form or another for over 2,000 years. It withstood contrary evidence on several occasions, and so I'm not going to read word for word here. They're going through the history of the idea of where life came from. People used to believe that life sprung from non-life all the time, such as fireflies from the earth. Another one is actual flies just popping out of meat. But then Louis Pasteur in 1862 refuted this and basically came up with the dictum, or the basically natural law, omni vivum ex vivo. Or if you actually pronounce it in the correct Latin, it would be omne vivum ex vivo, or all life comes from life. The implication of the Pasteur experiment was that every generation of every micro, plant, or animal was preceded by a generation of the same organism. So you can't get life from non-life. Life only comes from already living things. Okay. And then this view is endorsed enthusiastically by many other people, prominent among them John Tyndale, who on 21st of January 1870 lectured at the Royal Institution in London on the implications for panspermia. It is interesting and noteworthy that the newly established magazine Nature objected to this lecture in its editorial columns with some passion. So this is all kind of history stuff. I don't really see the need to pick this apart. But they're going through the history of spontaneous generation and then the proposal of panspermia. If life only comes from non-life, where did life come from? What if life came from outside of the Earth? Okay, let's skip ahead and get to something interesting right here. Even if we can see that the dominant neo-Darwinian paradigm of natural selection can explain aspects of the evolutionary history of life once life gets started, independent abiogenesis on the cosmologically diminutive scale of oceans, lakes, or hydrothermal vents remains a hypothesis with no empirical support and is moreover unnecessary and redundant. So here we get to our first creationist talking point that is being proposed not by creationists, but by evolutionists. So this is kind of why they dove into the history of spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation was refuted. Some people proposed panspermia instead. But here's the grand takeaway. Even if we concede that the Darwinian paradigm works to explain how we go from a single organism all the way up to the biodiversity we have today, what it cannot explain is how we got the first cell. And this is what creationists have said over and over and over again, and intelligent design advocates over and over and over again, that we don't know how life evolved. And I said in the last talk I gave on this that it's a pretty hot topic now among scientific circles online, on YouTube and other places, whether or not we are clueless about how the origin of life happened. There's been debates on it between speakers. But this paper is agreeing with creationists that life could not have started from non-life on this earth. They're using the idea that spontaneous generation has been refuted, and by kind of in equivocation saying abiogenesis is also not working. It doesn't work. It doesn't work in oceans, which was the original idea that the primordial soup, life arose in the oceans. It doesn't work in lakes, where maybe there are a bunch of minerals in lakes, like lakes are just full of organic materials, and an organism pops out from there. Basically, they abandoned the ocean or lakes hypothesis because it needed energy, right, to create an organism. It takes energy, and if it was in an ocean or a lake, there'd be too much energy hitting it. And energy, if it's not in the right form, destroys, right? If there's you can't form a cell in the presence of too much energy. So it's not like you can just have organic materials out in the open and then you just point the sun at it and the sun's rays give it the energy it needs. The sun's rays actually destroy stuff, right? If you walk down the street and you spend too much time in the sun, you walk down the street, you go to the beach and you're sunbathing, eventually the UV light from the sun is going to damage your skin cells, right? And cause cancers and things like that. So sunlight actually destroys. So they thought, what if the energy came from hydrothermal vents? Because that's a much softer origin of energy. That's not going to be as damaging. Maybe you have a hydrothermal vent, which is basically a vent under the water that is releasing like warm water. And now you get the warmth, the energy, and it's a little softer. It's not just blasting you with UV rays. Maybe life could evolve there. Um, and the hydrothermal vent idea has a lot of problems with it. And I'm not going to dive into those here. But the paper is saying oceans, lakes, hydrothermal vents, life evolving in any of these places is a hypothesis with no empirical support and is unnecessary and redundant. It could not happen. We have no way of how organisms evolved. And again, this is not creationists saying this. This is not James Tour saying this or any of the folks in intelligent design. It's not Ken Ham. This is these 33 scientists who are proposing a new origin of living things. With astronomical data now pointing to the existence of hundreds of billions of habitable planets in our galaxy alone, such a hypothesis seeking an independent origin of life on any single planet seems to be no longer necessary. So they're saying we've discovered so many planets, so many potential planets where life could have evolved possibly, that saying life had to evolve here doesn't make sense. You're just saying it has to happen here just because you like Earth, or it's just arbitrary, right? Just because life is here doesn't mean life started here. So they're going to propose that there are so many other planets where life could have evolved, and all the hypotheses for how life evolved here don't work. Therefore, we should more logically assume that life came from one of these other planets. And so now they talk about they've basically the oldest evidence of organisms that we see. There's microbial life in Canadian rock that formed 4.1 to 4.23 billion years ago. And according to them, this life that they found makes it more difficult to basically argue that that abiogenesis took place on Earth. The claim that these rocks may have been associated with hydrothermal vents still raises the question of how life could have originated in situ during the early Hadean epoch that was riddled with frequent and violent collisions by asteroids and comets. So here's another problem with mainstream ideas. they've discovered basically a microbial life in Canadian rocks from 4.1 to 4.23 billion years ago. In that time period where those organisms supposedly evolved, during that period in the old Earth paradigm, that timeline, that time period was fraught with catastrophic collisions from asteroids and comets. So basically, Earth is being pummeled over and over again from things from asteroids and comets from outer space. And so, how is life evolving? Even if it could evolve from hydrothermal vents, which it can't, it would be getting pummeled and destroyed by asteroids and comets during that time because for that period of time, Earth is just catastrophic. So it doesn't make sense to say that this is where life arose. So these organisms that we found from that long ago, 4.1 to 4.23 billion years ago, seem to suggest that life must have evolved from elsewhere and then was dropped onto Earth. And that's where we find it today, where it's fossilized in Canadian rocks. Okay, if I keep going at this rate, we are going to be here for hours and hours and hours. So I'm going to continue to skip ahead. But again, they talk more about how the conditions of life were so hot that organic molecules couldn't even survive, let alone evolve and create a living organism. So the conditions just weren't there in the timeline that life supposedly evolved. This leaves panspermia as the most plausible valid option for the origin of terrestrial life. The first microbes were on a different planet, and then meteorites and comets brought them here. Okay, then it's kind of a weird organization in this section, but then they turn back to the history of science. They talk about how in the turn of the 20th century, resistance to panspermia was very entrenched in scientific culture. So lots of scientists turned on panspermia and rejected it in the turn of the 20th century. And now they're claiming that rejecting panspermia is more just because it's popular to do so than because it doesn't have merit. And then they point to Lamarckian evolution as another example of when people rejected an idea just because they didn't like it, not because there's no evidence for it, which is another fascinating part of this paper that I'm not even going to dwell on for as long as I could. But Lamarckianism is a version of evolution that predated Darwin, but was rejected by Darwin and many other evolutionists of its day, and is currently rejected by a vast majority of evolutionists today, which basically says that traits evolve by use and disuse, and then the inheritance of acquired characteristics, which means an organism inherits characteristics during its lifetime by using its body, right? A giraffe stretches its neck out, or like a giraffe ancestor stretches his neck out, its neck gets a little longer, and then it passes that longer neck onto its offspring. This was an idea that, again, evolutionists rejected even before Darwin. Darwin didn't like it, and we've been rejecting it ever since. But this paper is actually going to say Lamarckianism actually has some merit, but it's being rejected by all scientists because we don't like it. It's a intellectual bias. And they equate that intellectual bias of Lamarckianism to panspermia and say people reject it just because they don't like it and they're biased against it. And so that's what they talk about for kind of the rest of this section. And I actually will spend a little more time on this because it gets really entertaining the way they talk about this. So I want to get into this part. Where can I pick up? Let's see. Let's pick it up right here. In our view, then, both panspermia and Lamarckian issues therefore contribute to our wider understanding as they go to the very heart of how life originated on Earth and how it subsequently evolved and diversified to the higher levels of sophisticated complexity that we witness today. In our view, natural selection in its essence, which means survival of the fittest, still plays a crucial role in a changing environment, but it is now in a cosmic rather than a pure terrestrial setting. And it occurs in both it occurs in concert with both non-Darwinian and non-Mendelian inheritance mechanisms. Yet we recognize the whole topic of evolutionary mechanisms is, like political beliefs, both fraught and is a heated area of social and cultural discourse, certainly in all those areas laying outside of normal scientific investigation. So here they are again pointing to Lamarckianism and panspermia as ideas that scientists don't like for similar to the reasons they don't like things for political reasons. So like how conservatives don't like DEI policies. They don't like those views. right? And so they reject them. They have a political bias. Now, that's not a bad thing, but they're going to point out that people reject panspermia and Lamarckianism because they don't like those ideas. And it's similar to how they think about politics. And then it gets really funny here. I really appreciate what they say. Yet the simple fact that cannot be denied is that the terrestrial biosphere is an infinitesimal part of a far bigger system, which is the astronomer's cosmos, and the two systems are inextricably connected. So he said, you cannot like these ideas all you want, but the fact of the matter is your theory has some challenges to overcome, and our theory answers those challenges. This then, here's the funny part. This then is a trigger warning. So because they brought up politics, they are now equating this to a political discussion. Here is your trigger warning. Accurate scientific terminology can be unsettling because of their history, yet sometimes unavoidable. The terms panspermia and Lamarckian inheritance, despite their emotive implications and prejudicial overtones, will be used where deemed appropriate in this paper. So even though panspermia has had some wacky connotations in the past, right? It used to literally refer to um, polytheistic gods. I said I wouldn't get into this, but it's part of the history of it. Polytheistic gods, um, how to say this politely, dropping their seed onto Earth. That's literally what it used to mean. But even though it had weird connotations in the past, the idea that life came from elsewhere is what they're advocating for. So they're going to use the word. Same thing with Lamarckianism, even though it was used kind of differently then, or they're not proposing it in the same exact way that Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed it. Even though they've had these connotations in the past, they're still going to use those words, and they know that people aren't going to like the fact they're using those words. So they basically set this up by saying you don't like these words because of their history and because of the political past, but we're going to use them anyway. So trigger warning for you. Which I assure you, if they were proposing something of intelligent design or of creationist overtones, they would say the same thing. They'd be like, here's your trigger warning. I know y'all don't like intelligent design. I know y'all don't like creationism. Here's your trigger warning. But, and then they would say that. But they're not creationists yet. They're not intelligent design advocates. Their alternative to the mainstream theory is life came from outer space. Okay. Um, Then they justify using these words. Correct theories always lead in logical ways to successive confirmatory instances and predict the discovery of novel phenomena in the real world. So now they set up their argument. It's a logical argument. It's an if-then argument, right? It's like in logic, we call it a hypothetical syllogism. If A, then B. If B, then C. Therefore, if A, then C. This is their argument. It's a hypothetical syllogism. One thing leads to the next thing. So if panspermia is true, then we can make certain predictions. That's not actually part of the argument because that would be fallacious because you're saying if A, then B, therefore if B, then A. But before I confuse you too much, really what they're saying is we'll be able to make predictions that come true. So if we can make predictions and those predictions come true, then our theory is likely correct. So there's your hypothetical syllogism. So basically, their argument is going like this. And this is how science works. It's like technically fallacious, but it's not. And I've written a whole blog article on this on the New Creation blog about how scientific reasoning is technically fallacious. It kind of goes, if my theory is true, then this observation will happen, or it can predict this thing, right? If evolution is true, then we should see this in the fossil record. And then when you find that in the fossil record, you're like, therefore evolution is true. But that's fallacious. That's a fallacy of affirming the consequent, where you say if A, then B, B, therefore A. And that's fallacious because B doesn't prove A in that instance. There could be many other reasons for B to be true other than A. So it's not true that B proves A. But if A is true, then B is true, right? That's the correct line of reasoning. But science works this way. It's a probability thing. If I can make predictions and these predictions are true, then it is very likely that my theory is true. It can increase the likelihood. And we reason like this all of the time. We do this type of reasoning everywhere. We think in probabilities, right? It's like inductive reasoning. So um, yeah, we that's what happens in our brains all the time. It's like, oh well, the my screen door is scratched up. That was probably my cat. My cat scratched up the screen door. There could be other reasons for your screen door being scratched up, but most likely it's your cat because you know your cat. Like I, my cat likes to scratch screen doors, so it's all probability. We do it all the time. So within that context, this is a logically sound argument for probability. Correct theories lead to confirmed predictions. Correct theories lead to confirmed predictions. And so they're going to show us times where they've made correct predictions based on panspermia. All right. So there we go. We are done with, I'm not going to read any more of the paragraph. I've broken it down enough already. There's 2 out of 19. All right. We are now ready to get into their actual arguments, their lines of evidence. So, number 3, cosmic theory of life. In the mid 1970s, the idea of prebiotic molecules existing in interstellar space or in comets was initially not part of mainstream scientific opinion. The original proposal by one of us, so one of the authors of the paper, they put his initials there, or her initials, I don't know who that is, for organic polymers in interstellar space in 1974 was followed by a long series of articles in collaboration with Fred Hoyle confirming head-on the reigning scientific paradigm of an origin of life on the Earth, the so-called Haldane-Oparin primordial soup theory. So Haldane-Oparin, those were the guys who proposed the primordial soup that an organism could evolve from a bunch of organic materials kind of mixed up in a soup. And that was that theory. However, obviously, they're going to dispute this theory. After discussing a variety of possible interstellar and circumstellar settings for the beginnings of biochemistry, Hoyle and Wickramasinghe turned to the ensemble of the estimated 10 to the power of 11 comets in our solar system alone as the favored setting for the origin of life on Earth. The anticipated radioactively heated interiors of these icy bodies containing liquid water domains replete with interstellar organics were argued to be enormously more favorable for an origin of life than anything that can be accomplished on the Earth. So, this is one of their predictions that they say came true. When origin of life scientists started to try and see how life could have evolved, they didn't find evidence of organisms on comets and then proposed panspermia. They predicted that the best place for organisms to evolve would not be on Earth, but would actually be in comets. So here is their prediction. That's what their first prediction that they're saying. They didn't discover evidence of organisms on comets and then propose panspermia. They were simply trying to predict where life is most likely to evolve, and some of them predicted that the best conditions were in comets. The inside of comets is actually warmer than the outside and therefore could house living things. So they actually predicted that there would be evidence of life in comets instead of just finding evidence of life in comets. So this is a prediction that they say came true. And just like that, we're done with number 3. So again, some of these are shorter, some of these are longer. Whew. But I am getting tired, and we're only on number 4, so good grief. Number 4, condition of living water. The existence of liquid water is a prerequisite not only for the origin of life, but for active microbiology as well. This requirement has come to the fore and been much publicized within the recent conclusion of NASA's Cassini mission. I am not familiar with NASA stuff. I know some people nerd out on that. I am not one of those people, so I don't know what that mission is, but I guess they discovered that water must be a prerequisite of life, and they discovered it on that mission. So when Fred Hoyle and one of us, there's the initials again, same person as before, I think. Yeah, so they proposed this one person, NCW. All right, let's find out who this is. NCW. NCW, here we go. They've quoted him twice, so I'm just gonna find this guy. Oh, look at that. It's Wickramasinghe himself. The man, the myth, the legend, the guy they've named the theory after. Okay, or one of his relatives. Yeah. Okay. So Wickramasinghe is actually part of this article. So no wonder they're saying his name over and over again. That's bad on me for not noticing that sooner. Um, yeah. So that's the guy. That's Wickramasinghe, the guy I keep probably abusing his name. So when Fred Hoyle and Wickramasinghe first proposed and developed the theory of cometary panspermia, there was no direct evidence for liquid water anywhere outside of the Earth. The inference of the presence of liquid water in comets and giant icy bodies of the solar system came from theoretical studies alone. So here's their next prediction. They predicted that living organisms could evolve inside comets, and then they predicted that we would find water outside of the Earth. Water had not been discovered outside of the Earth, but once they discovered that water was a prerequisite for having life, they then predicted that water would be found outside of Earth. Now, again, this is kind of the fallacious but not fallacious reasoning. If A, then B, B does not actually mean A. So it could just be that there's water, that life evolved on Earth or life was created on Earth, and water exists elsewhere in the solar system. That's not a crazy thing. Like it could be that that's the case, but it is something that they predicted. Scientists weren't thinking, oh, we're going to find water everywhere. But once they discovered that you need water to have life, then the panspermia advocates, Hoyle and Wickramasinghe, said, oh, well, there must be water outside of the Earth if our theory is true. Then they went out and discovered water outside of the Earth. And they found it in several different places, in comets, as well as icy solar system bodies. They found it in some of the uh, moons of Jupiter and moons of Saturn and the dwarf planet Ceres. There's all this evidence of liquid water outside of the Earth that they predicted they would find, which is a prediction that came true. Doesn't mean that panspermia is true. It's just, again, they're making their argument. So correct theories do produce good predictions. And they're trying to say that their predictions happened. All right, number 5. We're moving right along now, and this one's not too long either. Number 5, earliest terrestrial life. 3 decades ago, the earliest evidence for microbial life in the geological record was thought to be in the form of cyanobacterial fossils dating back 3.5 billion years ago. From the time of formation of a stable crust on the Earth, that's 4.3 billion years ago, following an episode of violent impacts with comets. They've already referred to this time period. Remember, they said life could not evolve during the Hadean time period, the Hadean epoch, because that whole epoch was defined by just being pelted by comets and asteroids, just drilling the Earth, making it so hot it's unbearable. Life could not have evolved, but we do see living fossils there. That's one of the arguments that they've already made. There seem to be available an 800 million years time span during which the canonical Haldane Oparin primordial soup may have developed. So they're looking at the old Earth history and the original theory of the primordial soup model. They said within this time period, these billions of years here, there was an 800 million year window that life could have evolved without being scorched, demolished, nuked by extraterrestrial space rocks. There's a period there where living organisms could evolve. And that was the idea. There's a window in there, even though life can't evolve during this destructive period. During this 800 million years, they could. So life has 800 million years to evolve, basically, to fit the current evolutionary paradigm. But of course, these scientists are going to dispute that life could evolve in that time period. And here's how they do it. Very recent discoveries, however, have shown that this time interval has been effectively closed. There's our creationist talking point. I can't think of a creationist paper that has been this specific about this, but I'm sure they're out there. I'm sure they've covered it. There are lots of reasons to believe that life could not evolve even during the 800 million year window. Further, And they don't actually give reasons for why that's closed, but they cite a paper. So I'm guessing if you read this paper, you can find some reasons why life could not have evolved in that 800 million year window. Further, detrital zircons from about 4.1 billion years ago, discovered in rocks belonging to a geological outcrop in the Jack Hills region of Western Australia, have been found to contain micron-sized graphite spheres with an isotopic signature of biogenic carbon. And so this proves the plausible, unequivocal evidence for the existence of microbial life on Earth before 4.1 billion years ago, during the time, the epoch of comet and asteroid impacts. So, even if life could evolve in an 800 million year window, which they don't think it did, we have evidence of life even before that window when life cannot evolve because of the asteroid impacts that are completely demolishing. It's a apocalyptic landscape at this point in time. Life could not evolve there, but we found fossil evidence that life did exist during that time when life couldn't evolve. So life evolved before it evolved. How crazy is that? That's what they're pointing out, that we have evidence of living things before living things evolved in the current evolutionary paradigm. And not only do we have things there, you can't just move your theory back and say, oh, well, I guess life evolved earlier, because now you've pushed that period before the window where life can evolve, and now your origin of life is taking place at a time when it is impossible for life to evolve. So those living organisms must have come from elsewhere, and then they land on Earth where life can't evolve. They die because life can't exist there, and then we find fossil evidence of them. Those are alien organisms, alien cells that are not from this Earth. And that's what they say. These data are consistent with the dating of first life on Earth for the just discussed data for early signs of cell-based life in Canada's oldest hydrothermal vent precipitates. So if we go based on orthodox abiogenic thinking, meaning the mainstream view, essentially instantaneous transformation of non-living organic matter to bacterial life occurs, an assumption we consider strains credibility of earthbound abiogenesis beyond the limit. So if you accept these organisms that they found in Canada that is older than the oldest, there is older than when life evolved, right? Life evolved 4 billion years ago. This was over 4.1 billion years ago. If you accept these organisms as the first life that evolved, and you accept the reasoning of mainstream abiogenesis researchers, then you have to believe that life did not evolve, but appeared in a pretty much immediate transformation, which is literally spontaneous generation. When creationists call abiogenesis spontaneous generation, everyone gets hot and bothered. Evolutionists get angry. They say it's two different things. Abiogenesis is a theory about how life evolved. Spontaneous generation is like magical life from non-life. But these scientists are pointing out that the evidence right now points to organisms that appeared before life could evolve on Earth in a time span that is so short that it's basically life appearing from non-life, and that's exactly what spontaneous generation is. So they don't like that. They don't like that idea. They're not saying spontaneous generation is true. They're saying the theory doesn't work and we need a new theory of the origin of life. So forget the hydrothermal vent primordial soup current abiogenesis model. You have to get life from elsewhere. You have to get it from outside of the Earth. Life evolving instantaneously strains credibility beyond the limit. Their words, not mine, not Ken Ham's, not Stephen Myers, not James Tours, not ICR's. Their logic, their argumentation. A far more plausible possibility. Whoa, what did I just do? There we go. A far more plausible possibility is that fully developed microorganisms and maybe other eukaryotic organisms arrived at the Earth via impacting comets, and these later became carbonized and trapped within condensing mineral grain conglomerates. Life landed on here on a comet and then left its fossilized, carbonized remains for us to find billions of years later. It is now becoming amply clear that Earth like planets and other life friendly planetary bodies exist in their hundreds of billions, and exchanges of material between them must routinely occur. Living things come from all over the universe and exchange living things from planet to planet regularly. And so, these living things that we're finding that are older than the first point when life evolved, they are extraterrestrial. Wow. All right. So again, if you're a mainstream evolutionist, if you accept the main neo-Darwinian explanation, this is stuff you got to think about. You have to wonder, how could we get life from non-life in just an 800 million year window? Well, we also have life before that window when life can't exist on Earth. It's a whole big paradox. It's a big problem, and current evolution can't explain it. So if you're an evolutionist, you have to consider the fact that maybe living things came from outer space, and that's their origins. And I don't like the idea, while I'm kind of here between number 5 and 6. I don't like the creationist response to this, which is, oh, if it couldn't happen here, then you're just pushing the problem elsewhere. You're just saying life evolved elsewhere. And I don't like that argument because it's within the bounds of the theory of evolution to say that, like, if you're an evolutionist, you believe life evolved somewhere, and if it can't evolve on Earth, then it is reasonable to suggest that it evolved on a different planet. It's not just pushing the problem away; it's just saying this theory doesn't work, and maybe life did evolve. Like, if evolution is true and life did evolve on another planet, then a creationist saying you're just pushing the problem elsewhere, that's not an argument against the actual theory. Like, if it's true, it's true, right? That's just I think it's just a rhetorical malpractice. That's not a good argumentation. And it's also disingenuous because creationists are often accused of saying, well, we don't know how it happened, therefore God did it. And we don't like it when people say we're doing that. And it feels like that kind of an argument when we say, well, you said Earth can't do it, so it must be a different planet. If it's a different planet, it's a different planet. Like, maybe it was. So I don't like that creationist response. And when this paper came out, there were so many creationists who did make that response. They were like, oh, they don't know how it happened here, so it must have just happened elsewhere. We're just pushing the problem back. Abiogenesis is still a problem. It still raises questions, but if it didn't happen on Earth, then it's okay for scientists to be like, well, where else could it have happened? Let's see if it happened elsewhere. That's just a logical extension of reasoning. A criticism that is often leveled against the cosmic life theory is that it does not solve the problem of life's origin, but merely transfers it elsewhere. That is exactly what I was saying about what the creationists all responded to with this paper. So, kind of I guess an L for creationists is that they often responded to this exact research, this exact paper, with an argument that was already addressed in this paper. So that's a little frustrating to see because I remember, I mean, it wasn't that long ago. Like, I was, let's see, 2018. I was 17 years old when this came out, so I was reasonably involved in creationism, and I remember seeing an article that wasn't this paper, but it was an article about this paper, talking about this new, panspermia and this theory. And I actually, I remember putting together a group email with colleagues and classmates of mine and sending it out and being like, look at this crazy thing that some scientists are proposing. So I remember this, and I remember reading creationists respond to it, and they use this argument that, again, is addressed inside this paper. So it's kind of frustrating to see that. Like, I'm questioning whether or not creationists who wrote about this paper even bothered to read the paper they were critiquing. It's likely to me that they just heard life came from outside of the Earth, and they went, that is such a ridiculous idea. I'm going to write an article about how silly they are, instead of actually reading the paper and responding to the arguments made in the paper. So something to keep an eye out, that creationists, and really this just goes for any type of media, anybody presenting on science instead of actually talking about science, or scientific papers, a lot of times, they're trying to get reactions, you're trying to get views, you're trying to get attention. And you also want to, you kind of have this mindset of, I need to bring the knowledge to the people. I need to bring arguments to the people and equip people. And they often overreact to things, and they overreact to, like, I think panspermia is a crazy idea, but I'm also reading the paper and trying to see where they're coming from and why they're arguing for what they're arguing for. If I had stopped when in 2018, if I had stopped as a 17-year-old, just read that article and said, "Wow, how crazy is it that people think that life came from outer space?" That wouldn't be very thorough, efficient, scientific, whatever word you want to use. That's not a very great argument or habit to fall into, because the argument is addressed in this paper. They said it's a criticism that you're just pushing the problem back. You're just saying, oh, if it couldn't happen on Earth, then it must have happened somehow elsewhere. And then they give an appendix that we can read more about this criticism. Whilst this may be true in the strictest sense, and you have to agree with it is pushing the problem to other planets, but it's the way in which the argument is presented, as if this is a refutation of their argument, to say that they're taking a question and answering it elsewhere. They're pushing it away. They're finding a different setting for it. The importance of knowing whether or not life originated or could have done so de novo in the most minuscule of cosmic environments here on Earth, as against the cosmos as a whole, is a scientific question of paramount importance and one that needs to be addressed. So even if we are taking a challenge that we've been trying to solve, and we are pushing that challenge elsewhere and saying, well, it couldn't have happened on Earth, it must have happened somewhere else, that's not just pushing the problem away and then leaving it and pretending that solves the whole issue. They still plan to do future research and find out how life could have evolved or originated elsewhere. They're still going to be doing that research. So throwing up your arms as someone who doesn't agree with them, throwing up your arms and saying, you're just pushing the problem back. Well, you're also dispelling the research, right? You're disparaging the research, and then you're stopping the research. And so scientists like to keep researching. Scientists want their research to not settle a matter, but to shed light on a matter and then encourage people to dig deeper and research more in that field. And that's what they're doing, right? They're trying to answer a question: did life originate here or did life originate elsewhere? And that's a scientific question. And if life originated elsewhere, then it originated elsewhere, right? They could be right. Life could have evolved elsewhere. And if it did evolve elsewhere, then us saying you're just pushing the problem, further back, that's all you're doing. Well, now we shut them down and we're not actually seeking answers, right? We just leave it at that. And if life did evolve elsewhere, then we are limiting ourselves in trying to find out the truth. Now, personally, I believe in the Bible. I believe God created living things on Earth. So I don't even agree with these panspermia scientists, but their argument here is completely legitimate, right? Their response to criticisms is legitimate. They're like, life evolved here or it evolved elsewhere, and we're saying it didn't evolve here. That's not just pushing a problem away or like wishing it away or explaining it away. We want further research, and we're pointing out it couldn't evolve here, then it must have evolved elsewhere. So they address that argument here. And so I really am bothered by people who responded in this way and then just moved on as if that refutes their whole idea. The cosmic theory of life that extends the interactive biosphere of all life to encompass a cosmological volume connecting all habitable niches in the universe has profound ramifications within evolutionary biology itself. So now they're proving the worth of their own research by saying, if we're right about this, this has profound implications on the entire field of evolutionary biology, which obviously it does. Some of these ramifications will emerge in other sections of this article, and see the further extended discussion of viewpoints in the appendices. Okay. So then they get a little technical here. They do dive into some technicalities, and for time's sake, because this was already going to be a long video, I'm not going to dive into the technical parts of what they bring up here. Nope. So number 7 gets technical. I do want to talk about more of number 6, because this gets I almost skipped over this, and that's good, because I did want to cover this. So let's keep going in this section. The transformation of an ensemble of appropriately chosen biological polymers, not polymers, monomers, very different things, of appropriately chosen biological monomers, such as amino acids or nucleotides, into a primitive living cell capable of further evolution appears to require overcoming an information hurdle of super astronomical proportions. So this is a creationist talking point number two. Creationist talking point number two. Number one is that abiogenesis is impossible because the primordial soup model does not work. Number two is that abiogenesis does not work because you have to get over the information hurdle. You need the most simple cell known to man has DNA, and that DNA contains information in the same way that the words I'm reading on this page contain information. You have to not only get the materials to build the cell, but you also must make those materials create information that can be understood, that can be read, right? It's a code that conveys meaning to your brain. So we look at genomes and read the nucleotides and find out what those nucleotides say, and we can glean knowledge from that and information from that. That's incredible, and that's a hurdle you have to overcome. Naturally, with no intelligence, you must have monomers combined to form an order that actually conveys meaning that determines the traits that the organism has. This is a hurdle that they say is of super astronomical proportions. Super astronomical. It is an event that could not have happened within the time frame of the earth, except we believe as a miracle. This could not have happened within the time frame of earth, except we believe as a miracle. What are we reading here? This is 33 professional scientists who have combined to put this paper together, and they're saying that to get information from non-living materials, from biological monomers, requires a miracle. Now, there is a caveat here, which is that they said, where was that? Yeah, the caveat is within the time frame of the earth. So they're not ruling it out entirely, absent a miracle. But again, current evolution theory has placed limitations on where life can evolve. It can't happen here because Earth does not have the conditions required for life. Earth is too hot here. There's too many meteorites here. And then you have life here. So there's a window where life can evolve, right? Between where conditions aren't favorable and we actually have evidence of living things. Okay? No life can evolve. And then at some point we have living organisms. And there's a window in there of time in which life had to evolve from non-life. If you accept the current evolutionary theory, they are saying that life is so complex, right? Information must evolve. And for that to happen within that time frame, that would take a miracle. Now, lots of people think it would take a miracle regardless of how much time you give it. You can put together all sorts of monomers. You have amino acids, nucleotides. You can put them in the perfect conditions, perfect primordial soup. However, whatever conditions that are rife for creating life. And you just put that in an incubator, whatever perfect conditions, you do all the studies, you find out perfect temperature, perfect everything. You put it all together, and humans have tried to do this too, which is why we think this. You put it all together, perfect conditions, and you give it 100 billion years, and you're never going to get a single cell because you have to overcome the information hurdle. The monomers must combine and form information. And this is an intelligent design argument, right? For DNA. It's like assuming you have the physical materials to make it, like letters, right? You have a bunch of different pieces of letters. Assuming you have the materials, you now need to kind of get those materials to organize themselves into information, into words and sentences, right? It doesn't matter how much time you give words, you're never going words to jumble themselves in the right sentences, right? You can do all sorts of combinations, just scramble it, scramble it, scramble it, scramble it over the course of 100 billion years, and you're never going to get the book Green Eggs and Ham in the exact order that Dr. Seuss wrote it in, right? Let alone, and that's like a simple one, right? You're never going to get the simplest form of life, let alone something on the line of, you know, of Homer's The Odyssey or Shakespeare's Hamlet. You're never going to get books that the Bible, right? These big, big books. You can't even get the simple ones. Um, so that's kind of the argument. So a lot of creationists, pretty much all creationists, intelligent design advocates, all the people who were in the there is a God or designer camp, we don't think it can happen in perfect conditions, no matter how much time you give it. But the admission here by this paper is pretty profound that in the timeline we are given in the current evolutionary model, that window of time that we have, which this paper has already said, that window has been closed because of papers that they've already cited that point to problems within that window. But even in that window, I think it's 800 million years, life evolving in that window is essentially a miracle. Okay, I'm going to keep going. All laboratory experiments attempting to simulate such an event have so far led to dismal failure. Can we call that creationist talking point number 3? Because I've heard that from every creationist. We've tried to create life in a lab and it hasn't worked. Over and over again, it leads to failure. I think I want to call that talking point number 3. It would thus seem reasonable to go to the biggest available venue in relation to space and time. A cosmological origin of life thus appears plausible and overwhelmingly likely to us, and various ideas that have a bearing on this question have been explored in great depth by Hoyle, Wickramasinghe, and Gibson et al. There you have it. It can't happen in the timeline that we have for it. Therefore, if we bring the problem to outer space, you get a whole lot more time, you get a whole lot more space, you get a bunch of different varieties of conditions because planets aren't exactly the same. There's a bunch of different types of conditions out there. You have billions of comets that have that are basically like incubators. You have all of this out there. Maybe a cell could form in those conditions, given that much time, given that much space, given those many conditions. Maybe that could happen. Okay. That's number 6. That was a doozy, wasn't it? That was if you're a creationist and you've heard these talking points from other creationists, and maybe you've used these arguments before too, you're seeing them word for word in this paper. We can't create life. Life can't evolve. It can't overcome the information hurdle all by itself. The current evolutionary paradigm doesn't work for that. It's fascinating stuff. All right, number 7, organic molecules and biological dust in space and in comets. Okay. This gets very technical, but I'm trying to find places where I can summarize it pretty well. Basically, they have found organic materials in ever-increasing complexity, and they found it just by using telescopes and instruments. Right? We've developed new instruments, developed better telescopes, infrared, microwave, radio observations. We have basically expanded our technology, expanded our range into how far into the universe we can probe and find things. And we continue to find organic materials. So you have the physical stuff you need to work with to make life. We've been finding it out of our solar system. Enough that basically this can be reasonably interpreted by Hoyle and Wickramasinghe as tenable evidence for life being a cosmic phenomenon. So life originated in outer space. There is evidence that has been collected for over 3 decades. They've found a mixture of semi-bituminous, I'm going to be honest, I don't know what that means, coals and desiccated E. coli bacteria, suggesting the process of bacterial degradation leads to the formation of interstellar coal. So coal, of course, is living materials that is being broken down, and they found evidence of coal being formed outside of Earth, which means there were organic creatures that died and were decaying to create the coal. So they say that basically you could model, when you're trying to create life in a laboratory, you could model extraterrestrial conditions for life. Like they could have modeled their own experiments after conditions in outer space, but because they don't like the idea of life coming from outer space, no one has actually tried to explore the idea of recreating conditions in comets or outside of the Earth or anywhere else. No one's tried that as a method to create life because they're so committed to the idea that life evolved terrestrially. So again, they're bringing back the idea that things are that scientists are biased against their view. And then they go through the history of when organic materials in space were first found, put forward by Wickramasinghe. That guy really has done a number on this paper and is, of course, an author on the paper. And they proposed that in the 80s. Yeah, so they get pretty technical here in terms of the materials. I'm not a physicist. I've never taken a class in physics. And I wasn't the best at chemistry, so I've read all of this and could kind of maybe go through the basics, very very basics, but a lot of the stuff I'm not an expert in. And again, these scientists are all PhD level scientists from different fields, so I'm certain some scientists are kind of taking over the writing duties for this section that maybe haven't been writing up until this point. Like they're all kind of have their own areas of expertise. This is not my area of expertise, but they do critique a former model that was basically the dirty snowball comet model that used to be the reigning paradigm. That basically comets landing on Earth at least provided some of the materials for life to evolve on Earth. So life evolved on Earth, but some of the organic materials that we need for life came from outer space. And one of the ways it did that was on basically dirty snowball comets, comets that contain these organic materials, landed on Earth, and then helped life evolve from there. That's not panspermia. That's just some of our makeup. Some of the things that make up our cells is from outer space, but not the organism. And so they critique that idea. But basically, I'm just going to move on. So that's number 7 is basically there's a lot of materials we find in outer space from other planets, from comets that basically are organic materials. So here's a picture of jets of organic materials and molecular oxygen found emerging from a comet. So that's stuff that's kind of shooting out here is actually material flying off of this comet that is made up of stuff that organisms are made of. So it's organic material there. And what materials are on there? Where does it say figure 3? There it says it. So water vapor. Water is needed for organics, for organic material, and some of that is water. And then it just says organics. So I'm not sure what material specifically. Uh-oh. I clicked on the reference, so it jumped to the bottom. But it doesn't say what organic materials specifically are there. But it does say some organic materials, and then water is what's flying off the comet there. So we found materials that would make life. And again, that was a prediction that they pointed to. That was a prediction that Panspermia made that has since come true. Here's some more. So oxygen is another one. Oxygen and H2O, and then organics. I don't know what organics, but organics. Okay, so that covers number 7. I didn't go as in depth there, but you can see the paper, you can read it, you can Google all of the terms if you want to dive in more. I'm not going to do that here because, frankly, I've been going at this for a long time and I want to finish it. So number 8, evidence for extant life on Mars. Whoa. So maybe Mars has something to say about the origin of life. The scientific history of the issue of life on Mars is a story in itself, yet very significant in the cosmic biology context. Wickramasinghe, look at that. Guess who? The early positive results of these two guys from 1970s basically find evidence that there was organic materials on Mars. So there you have it. There's a paper by two people from the 1970s. And that's been a while. That's a long time ago, 1970s. But they point out that their research about microbial life being detected on Mars has not been properly refuted. So they've actually not just organics, but actual actual microbes. They are claiming they found on Mars, and it has not been properly refuted according to this paper. So how about that? Ruff and Farmer conclude that although fully abiotic processes are not ruled out for the Martian silica structures, they satisfy an a priori definition of potential biosignatures. It is therefore appropriate that the extensive data set relating to the possibility of extant Martian life is fully appraised. So there could be Martians living on Mars right now, microbial Martians, but Martian organisms nonetheless. So that covers number 8. Moving right along. Number 9, microbial material in the stratosphere and meteorites. Data from cometary studies continue to be backed up by recoveries of microbial material in the stratosphere. Biological entities ranging from viable but non-culturable microbes to unexplained aggregates of microscopic biological entities continue to be recovered from heights in the range of 30 to 41 kilometers in the atmosphere. So apparently we keep finding organisms in the outer ranges of the atmosphere. So while we would assume that those come from the Earth and were caught up in the atmosphere somehow, they are proposing that maybe those actually came from outer space and got caught in our atmosphere going from the outside in instead of the inside out. The evidence has been interpreted to show it is consistent with the plausible conclusion that these microorganism-like entities are incoming to Earth from space, possibly transported by small comets. So again, instead of organisms going from the surface of the Earth to the atmosphere, what if they came here from outer space on comets, and then they got I guess shed from as the comet's going through the atmosphere, they are knocked off of the comet or shed by the comet, and they end up in our atmosphere. And if you want a really cool science fiction book that plays with this idea, Michael Crichton's book, The Andromeda Strain, is really, really good. Basically, the premise there is that there's a organism that basically gets caught on a satellite. It lands on a satellite. And so scientists are doing this experiment where they send up a satellite to take some tests in the atmosphere, and then they retrieve the satellite when it drops to the ground, and then they can get the results. But this something, it catches something in the atmosphere, and then it drops and it lands inside of a town. And when the scientists go to the town to retrieve it, everyone in the town is dead. So that's all I will say about it, but it kind of plays with this idea that there's something in our own atmosphere that could kill us at any time. It's just sitting up there, and we don't know what it is, and it's very spooky, and the way in which people are dead is mysterious. And so the whole book, they're trying to figure out what happened in the atmosphere that turned this satellite into basically a virus transport, or if it was a virus or whatever it is. So very good book there. And that kind of plays with the idea. So we're seeing microbial microbial life in the atmosphere. And then right here, I was reading the word. That's why I said fossils on accident. The most recent discovery of microbial fossils in meteorites that fell in Sri Lanka in 2012, and the unequivocal determination based on oxygen isotope data that the rocks are not of Earth origin provides strong evidence of panspermia. So if you believe that all life is on Earth and that we haven't had life seeded on Earth from outer space, and then an asteroid lands, becomes a meteorite, and you go into the meteorite and you discover organisms on the meteorite, you would assume that it was from here. You would assume that the organisms here on Earth then basically hopped onto the meteorite, because there's organisms everywhere, right? There's microbes everywhere, all over me right now, all over the wall behind me. Every surface is basically covered in microbes. So a meteorite being covered with microbes isn't very shocking. But they are saying that the meteorite clearly came from outside of the Earth, and so there's strong evidence that some of these materials on the on the meteorite, actually did come from outer space. Okay. They also see red rain events recorded throughout history. So there are phenomena in which, most recently in India in 2012 in Sri Lanka, basically red pigmented coloration in the sky, basically called red rain. And the evidence currently suggests that those are organisms, basically red pigmented organisms. And so what are the odds that those are terrestrial origins? Not very likely according to this paper. So they're probably from outside of the Earth. And there you have it, microbial material in the atmosphere, the stratosphere, and in meteorites. Okay, number 10. This is where we get to viruses. Viruses as dense information-rich control systems. And so they say, I'm not going to go through each of this, but this is a bullet points of lots of different lines of evidence. And the argument is basically all DNA and RNA viruses infecting bacterial or eukaryotic cells are tightly ordered and dense information systems. All known cellular systems carry integrated virus genetic information or fragments thereof, or are potentially targets of virus attack and infection. These axioms do not contradict any principle in any modern textbook. Indeed, since Felix Durrell and Frederick Twort in 1915-1917 discovered the filterable agents that could infect and kill bacterial cells, we now have an almost complete understanding of the essential principles of virology. So then they go through here all the things we know about viruses and how they work. And I'm not an expert in viruses either. I do know how viruses work and like the basics. But basically here, they basically give you a summary of all of virology, the study of viruses. Here is all the things that we know about viruses. And so let's keep going here. This is all we know about viruses. You can read this through yourself if you want to know more about viruses. But basically, they are very information dense. They have lots and lots of genetic material in them that is very dense with information. And that's a pretty complex thing. And they're going to propose these viruses are of extraterrestrial origin. This checklist is underpinned by the important experiments on RNA viruses by these people, San Juan and his associates. It will be expected that finely tuned, information-dense viral genomes are susceptible to random mutations which cripple their speed of replication and infectivity. So there are mutations that affect how quickly viruses can reproduce and replicate and infect organisms. Using site-directed mutagenesis to produce randomized mutations in viral genomes, up to 40% of such mutated nucleotides results in clear lethals. This is only an estimate, as substitutions leading to amino acid replacements is not the only mutation hazard a virus can encounter. Silent substitutional changes in the third position wobble site in a codon can have functional consequence affecting replication and ineffective efficacy caused by co-translational pausing delays as the polypeptide exits the ribosome. These effects lead to anomalies in folding kinetics due to variations in the composition of the nucleotide triphosphate precursor pool. Well-conserved RNA structures in the HCV RNA genome, then manipulated a third position synonymous sites, can alter the ability of the virus to replicate and hence infect. Holy moly, why did I just read that whole paragraph? I don't know. But basically, I believe this is saying, and again, there are a bunch of people here who are of different expertises. I don't know if these people are all authors on this paper. I'm guessing some of them might be. But this is definitely the virologists writing this. You don't see Wickramasinghe in this section at all. These are the virus experts, and they're pointing out that there are mutations that happen in viruses that can affect their whole genome. So the sophistication of viral infectivity and their modus operandi, their mode of operation of cell-to-cell spreading does not end here. So there's a whole field of studying how mutations impact viruses and how they infect other organisms, how they replicate, and all of that. Oof, okay. Let's get to their argument here. What are they trying to say? However, it needs pointing out, again, that the most terrestrial viruses have already evolved established molecular interactive host-parasitic relationships. Many by themselves are benign and non-cytolytic, such that many initial infections are usually silent and asymptomatic. Physicians and clinicians now understand that the main health problem is often the unintended tissue damage caused by inflammatory responses by the host's adaptive immune response launched prior to the establishment of chronic infection stages, HCV-induced hepatitis as an example. So Here they're saying that the problems caused by viruses are not actually the viruses directly causing uh, bad results. The virus is actually doesn't infect or harm or damage the host except indirectly. It's basically it's not intended. The unintended tissue damage caused by the like allergic reaction basically of the host. So it's not that the virus gets in there and directly damages the organism. It's that it goes in and it lives in the organism. It infects the organism, but silently, asymptomatically. But the host has like this health allergic reaction that causes tissue damage that damages the host organism. So it's not that the host is perfectly adapted to damaging the organism. The host is indirectly causing tissue damage because of an inflammatory response by the host's immune system. So it's kind of like how when you're sick, it's not that the virus that you have, or it's not that the virus that you have is causing you to have a runny nose, a sore throat, um, aches and pains, whatever the virus is causing. The virus isn't causing that, but your immune system is recognizing something foreign in the system. And in fighting back against the virus, it causes symptoms. It's the same exact thing. So, what viruses do is they cause symptoms through the immune system. Your immune system responds to viruses, and that gives you a sore throat, a runny nose, whatever the virus is. All the symptoms of the virus is your immune system fighting back against the virus because it's foreign. So they're saying that viruses aren't, this is they're not perfectly adapted in a sense to harming or mutating or whatever they do to the organism. It's rather our almost allergic reaction. There seems to no end to the inventive strategies that viruses employ to infect and take over their target cells, whether they are bacterial viruses or eukaryotic metazoan cells. If we just consider a recent RNA virome sample for invertebrate hosts, the complex magnitude of which, with the swapping and sharing of viral gene sequences, is staggering in its scope. So the more complex of a host you get, the more staggeringly complex the virus is. Basically, their conclusion is that viruses don't seem to be terrestrial. They don't seem to be like other things on Earth. Um, they cause us to have an immune response. They don't actually attack our systems. And they're extraordinarily complex and dense with information. So they're trying to pick out these clues that might indicate that viruses came from elsewhere in the universe. And those are some of the clues they're proposing. I think I'm going to skip over the rest of this section. But basically, the way viruses and retroviruses operate make them seem out of this world. They are dense information packets. They their mutations can affect their replication and the way that they infect other organisms. And their effect on the other organisms isn't direct, but it causes our immune systems to respond. So it's like they're out of the ordinary. And so therefore, there's a lot of evidence to suggest they're from outer space. Now, is this convincing to me? Uh, I don't believe in panspermia. I'm just reading their paper. This seems to be on the outset a weaker argument than some of the other ones that they've made personally, but I'm not a virologist. I'm admitting to you that I don't understand everything that they're saying. I didn't read through all these bullet points. So maybe there's more to it here than I'm seeing. But just from reading their paper and understanding what they're saying, like, okay, viruses are weird. They've always been kind of creepy to me, how they operate, how they'll break into a cell, they multiply, and they break out of the cell, and use the host cell's DNA and pieces. They blow up the cell from the inside out and use its material to build more. They're pretty terrifying little critters. So they're a little out of this world, but that alone isn't going to make me be like, they must be from outer space. So, and if I'm misunderstanding what they're saying, someone call me out on it, give me a comment, send me an email, be like, hey, they're actually saying this. But my understanding is they're basically just making this big argument for how viruses are weird. Okay. Number 11, criticism of host specificity and survival under space conditions. A criticism that has been leveled against the concepts of viruses causing disease and contributing to the evolution of life is encapsulated in a single rhetorical question. How can a virus from space know ahead of its coming here the range of organisms that are available with which it can interact? Okay, that's a good question. So they're saying because viruses can infect us, they are from outer space, our allergic reaction, or I keep saying allergic, it's probably not allergic, but our immune responses to viruses are because viruses are from outer space. But the virus is still infecting us. It's still infecting bacteria. So how is a virus from elsewhere in the solar system, from other planets, how does it already have the capacity and information to infect organisms it knows nothing about and has not interacted with ever? And then it comes to Earth and can somehow infect and interact with organisms here? That doesn't sound right. So that's the criticism. So they say, let's see the response. In the previous section, we have elaborated on the correct answer to this question. Viruses originating in a cosmic context and evolution on the Earth are inextricably intertwined. So basically, the viruses on Earth and the viruses on elsewhere are pretty similar. Like viruses don't have a diversity of forms. They do, but like they don't have it. It's so drastic that they don't have a wide variety of host organisms. They kind of have a type. There's a type of like a virus is all kind of broadly one type of thing, and it can infect a wide variety of organisms. So terrestrial viruses and extraterrestrial viruses are pretty similar. And so if there are organisms on another planet, viruses here can probably infect them, and viruses there can probably infect things here. The host specificity of viruses is maintained only over fairly narrow ranges of species that are defined by their evolutionary history. Thus, the influenza A virus can be cultured in hen's eggs, so attesting to host specificity to within 50 million years of evolutionary history. The Ebola virus affects the class of primates. So when a virus specifies in a certain type of organism that it can infect, that happens in a pretty short period of evolutionary time. So a virus begins as a wide, opportunistic infector, and it specializes in a group of organisms over time. And that time doesn't have to be that long, only like 50 million years of evolutionary history. And in the meantime, it also infects other creatures that are even just a little similar to its main target organism. So it has this range of organisms it can infect, and the range might narrow over time because they specialize with one organism, but it can still affect other things. So it's a wide range of things that it can affect. And then basically they refute the idea that viruses can't survive space by basically saying, yes, they can. We found evidence of viruses embedded in rock, carbonaceous material of ice. We basically found viruses in lots of places that things mostly can't survive in. We found them to remain fully viable for millions of years. So there are places where viruses are basically surviving for millions and millions of years and can infect things once they are uncovered after all this time, and even under space conditions. This is true. I don't know why anyone's doubting that organisms can survive space. We know bacteria spores can, certain viruses can, tardigrades can. It's pretty cool they can do that, but it's not something that really is disputable. They've done space experiments conducted aboard the International Space Station that have shown remarkable survival properties of bacteria and viruses. So they stick bacteria, viruses on the International Space Station in the vacuum of space, and they survive. So it's not really okay to just be like, they can't survive space, because they absolutely can. And then they keep going here. Lots and lots and lots of examples. The microorganism here that survive in extreme conditions. Okay. That's number 11. Things can survive in space, and viruses have a wide range of things they can infect, which means a virus from elsewhere can probably infect things here, even though what am I saying? Even though your immune response is what causes the symptoms, not the virus actually directly causing symptoms. It's your immune response, which indicates that viruses might actually not be normal creatures. They could just be non-normal creatures. but they could be aliens, one or the other. Okay, number 12. We are getting there. We are on we're only on page 9. Holy moly. There are a lot of appendices. I'm only going to get into a little bit of the appendices, so fear not. I'm not going to get through all 21 pages, but let's look at number 12 here. Retroviral induction model. We now also have a far better understanding of clear non-Darwinian and non-Mendelian evolutionary inheritance mechanisms shaping both the immune and central nervous systems in particular. Whoa, and then we have Lamarckianism, Lamarckian inheritance. So they warned us, they gave us the trigger warning that they would use the word Lamarck, and there he is. So basically, they're saying in our immune system and our central nervous system, they see Lamarckian systems of inheritance applying. Basically, this is not Darwinian, it's not natural selection, it's not Mendelian methods of evolutionary inheritance. It's simply Lamarckianism. It's organisms obtain a trait in their lifetimes and then pass that trait on to their offspring. And they see that in our immune system and our central nervous system. And they explain that, I believe, by using retroviruses. So their idea is that we gain new information and gain traits from retroviruses, we just meaning organisms, and then we pass those traits on to our offspring directly. It's not Mendelian, which means like, the two alleles from one from the mother, one from the father, and they match up, they're homologous and heterozygous. It's not like that. It's not Mendelian. It's not Darwinian. It's Lamarckian. It's obtaining traits via retroviruses that come in and change around our genes. And then those are inherited by the next generation. And they cite several papers talking about this, as well as retrovital, retroelemental drivers of segmental duplications and genomic block structure of ancestral haplotypes and related non-Darwinian inheritance phenomena of medical significance. We have a Dawkins reference in here. Is that Richard Dawkins? Let's take a quick look. I bet it is. Where did that go? C. I see the C's. Where did D go? Is it down here? Yeah, Richard Dawkins. Okay, so there's a Richard Dawkins sighting. Again, not an author of this paper, but I don't think. Let me check. Is he an author? I would be shocked if he was an author on this. Yeah, I don't see him. Okay, so we have a Richard Dawkins citation there on these retroviruses. So, and I actually did see a video recently of Dawkins talking to another scientist who was trying to convince him that Lamarckianism was true, and Dawkins wouldn't hear it. But he's basically they cite him there talking about non-Darwinian inheritance phenomena. And according to this paper, it's kind of Lamarckian, right? It's obtaining traits in your lifetime and passing those traits on to offspring. A plethora, gotta love that word if you are a fan of the Three Amigos. What is a plethora? The plethora of adaptive Lamarckian-like inheritance mechanisms in general are discussed elsewhere. And now I get a bunch of other papers about Lamarckian inheritance, and no Dawkins there because he doesn't like Lamarckianism. So again, the Dawkins one up here, this is referring to segmental duplications and genomic block structure. So, and haplotypes. So basically this gets really complex into genetics. I've been doing some reading up on this actually kind of recently about how these things work, but basically there are lots of traits and like there will be a section of a gene that has a bunch of different traits and they're together on the gene. So they're usually inherited together because they're all close to each other in space on the genome. So usually this cluster of traits is inherited together, and that's called a haplotype. So it's a bunch of different traits together that are usually inherited together because they're close on the gene. So like how you usually, what's a good example? Like brown hair or dark hair and brown eyes might be inherited together usually because the genes for both of those is close together on genome. I'm spitballing here. That might be a bad example. but you kind of get the picture. Multiple traits are inherited together because they are close together on a gene. So that's not technically Darwinian inheritance. It's not natural selection. It's closer to Mendelian inheritance, but it's not really either of those. And so they cite that here. And then we get Lamarck, and then a bunch of papers that are talking about Lamarckian inheritance. And so they're proposing these things can be affected by retroviruses, viruses changing the genes, and then those changed genes get inherited, which has to be germline. If a mutation is, it has to be in the germline cells, which is our sex cells, basically, sperm cells, egg cells, for it to be inherited. Because like if you get a infection in your somatic cells, that won't be inherited. Okay, so they go on and on and on here. There's a whole lot here giving an overview. I've kind of already laid out for you my knowledge. Everything beyond what I told you is basically some form of expert knowledge, and I have a very much a passing bachelor's degree in biology knowledge of that. So I'm going to move on. But the basic idea is that genes are altered, changed by retroviruses, and that gives basically a Lamarckian inheritance. So when they talk about Lamarckian inheritance and panspermia being two kind of taboo ideas that scientists don't like, they're actually interwoven a little bit, because panspermia gives you extraterrestrial viruses that change genes, and then through that you get Lamarckian inheritance. So they're actually related. Okay, let's get to the fun part. This part gets really, really fun. This is the evolution of intelligent complexity, number 13. This is where we get to the cephalopods. So, evidence of the role of extraterrestrial viruses in affecting terrestrial evolution has recently been plausibly implied in the gene and transcriptome sequence of cephalopods. So, viruses must have affected cephalopods, which are octopuses, squid, cuttlefish, nautilus. Those have been affected by extraterrestrial viruses. They've had their genes altered. And what is their evidence of this? Well, the genome of the octopus shows a staggering level of complexity with 33,000 protein coding genes more than is present in Homo sapiens. Now, this is a problem that I pointed out with the mainstream evolutionary view. In the mainstream evolutionary view, a prediction is that simple organisms appear early on in the fossil record, and as you move up, more and more complex organisms appear. But cephalopods are even more genetically complex than humans are. And humans are at the very, 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 very top of the fossil record, and cephalopods appear very, very, very low in the fossil record. If all you had to work on when you're forming your theory of evolution is current cephalopods and current humans, you would place humans earlier than cephalopods. That would be your prediction. But in real life, cephalopods are beneath humans by quite a long time. Quite a long time. Octopus belongs to the coleoid subclass of mollusks that have an evolutionary history that stretches back over 500 million years. Remember, that's Cambrian era. That's Cambrian explosion time period. 500 million years ago is the Cambrian explosion. That's some of the earliest organisms. So cephalopods appear in the fossil record before most organisms, and yet they are some of the most complex organisms, genetically speaking, that we know of or that exist. They say, although cephalopod phylogenetics is highly inconsistent and confusing. And I break this down in my other video on this paper, which is basically that phylogenetics basically puts organisms onto a family tree, and cephalopods don't fit on that family tree anywhere. They're so genetically distinct that you can't really place them somewhere that makes sense in the evolutionary history of life. They're like the weird cousins that you're like, are they really related to us? I don't think they're related to us. Shout out to my cousins. I don't really have crazy weird cousins. So, but if you do, you know, maybe they're like cephalopods. Maybe they're aliens. Maybe your cousins are aliens and they're actually not related to you. Could be. Could happen. Cephalopods are also very diverse with the behaviorally complex coleoids. squid, cuttlefish, octopus, presumably arising under a pure terrestrial evolutionary model from the more primitive nautiloids. So they're proposed to have evolved from nautiloids, which are like a more primitive version of cephalopods. However, the genetic divergence of octopus from its ancestral coiloid subclass is very great, akin to the extreme features seen across many genera and species noted in the punctuated equilibria patterns from Eldridge and Stephen Jay Gould. So, Stephen Jay Gould famously, and I have a blog about this on the Creation Reformation blog, so go check that out. Stephen Jay Gould proposed a theory called punctuated equilibrium, which tried to explain how things appear suddenly in the fossil record by saying that evolution doesn't really happen for millions and millions of years, and suddenly a lot of evolution happens and a lot of things appear suddenly in the fossil record. This paper is saying that octopuses are so different from other members of their group that their appearance in the fossil record, combined with their genetic complexity, basically means that they're like punctuated equilibrium. They appear so suddenly that the evolution has to be really, really rapid. They don't fit with their ancestors. They are the weird cousins of the weird cousins. It's a large brain, sophisticated nervous system, camera-like eyes, flexible bodies, instantaneous camouflage, via the ability to switch color and shape are just a few of the striking features that appear suddenly on the evolutionary scene. So, one minute you have organisms that don't have any of these traits. Then, suddenly, in the fossil record appears a creature that has a large brain, this very sophisticated nervous system compared to everything else, camera-like eyes, intelligently designed eyes, flexible bodies. You've all seen Finding Dory. Flexible octopus bodies. Instantaneous camouflage via the ability to switch color. They can change color and camouflage. They can change their own shape. All of these features were not present in the last organism, but suddenly octopuses have all of them. The transformative genes leading from the consensus ancestral nautilus. Nautilus is, again, the consensus ancestor. So everyone believes it's the ancestor of octopuses. To the common cuttlefish, to the squid, to the common octopus are not easily to be found in any pre-existing life form. It is plausible then to suggest they seem to be borrowed from a far distant future in terms of terrestrial evolution, or more realistically from the cosmos at large. They are borrowing things that shouldn't exist for another hundreds of millions of years, but they're borrowing those traits, genetically speaking, from the future, and they have them in the past. They're not arguing for time travel, but they are arguing that these complex traits did exist already. They just existed extraterrestrially. And then they were implanted to the cephalopods in retroviruses. Retroviruses gave them these abilities by altering their genes. Such an extraterrestrial origin is an explanation of emergence, of course, runs counter to the prevailing dominant paradigm. So they are recognizing their explanation of cephalopods runs counter to the mainstream theory of evolution. However, consistent with this conclusion are the recent RNA editing transcriptome-wide data on the somatic RNA diversification mechanisms in the behaviorally sophisticated cephalopods, such as octopus. These data demonstrate extensive evolutionary conserved adenosine to inosine mRNA editing sites in almost every single protein coding gene in the behaviorally complex colloid cephalopods, octopus in particular, but not in the nautilus. They italicize that, and here's why. They're pointing out that it's not just that the octopus has some cool super abilities that organisms did not have before it, but that their protein coding, where's the part? Protein coding genes behave differently than the protein coding genes of the nautilus. So their literal proteins function differently. Their mRNA editing sites function differently from the nautilus. This is an intrinsic feature that evolved suddenly on the scene, and this does not make sense in the current evolutionary paradigm. How do you get this sudden evolutionary change in the way proteins are coded, the way mRNA editing sites function? mRNA editing sites, that's messenger RNA. These are parts of, these are like, they're like enzymes. They're machines basically in the cell that edit messenger RNA strands to create proteins. And they function differently in the octopus than they do in the nautilus, which is supposed to be its ancestor. This enormous qualitative difference in cephalopod protein coding, A to I mRNA editing, compared to nautilus and other invertebrate animals is striking. So it's a very, very striking difference between the two. Let's skip down. Yet in squid, in particular octopus, it is the norm, with almost every protein coding gene having an evolutionary conserved A to I mRNA editing site isoform, resulting in a non-synonymous amino acid change. This is virtual qualitative jump in molecular genetic strategy in a supposed smooth and incremental evolutionary lineage. So they're saying supposedly this all evolved in a straightforward evolutionary pathway, right? Step-by-step process. But instead, we get this giant qualitative jump in molecular genetic strategy. So in the very strategy that the genetics work, right? In the way in which an organism creates proteins. This is methodology. The way in which an organism codes new proteins has evolved in methodology or in strategy. The way they do it has dramatically changed in a supposed evolutionary chain step-by-step process. How often in evolutionary history do we see an organism change the way it codes proteins suddenly in an evolutionary chain? Most of the time, if you're looking at two organisms and they have different means of protein coding, you're going to put them as distant in the family tree. You're going to put them phylogenetically way distant because that is a very intrinsic trait. Okay? Organisms that have very different intrinsic traits go very, very far from each other on the tree. If you have a eukaryotic cell and something else is a prokaryotic cell, they are very, 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 very distantly related, extremely distantly related. And their common ancestor is billions of years ago. If an organism has photosynthesis, and then this other organism doesn't do photosynthesis and does cellular respiration instead, or only cellular, they both do cellular respiration. If one has photosynthesis and one just has cellular respiration, they are different. They are distant relatives because they get their energy differently. Those are fundamental biological processes, and if they do it differently, then they're distant relatives. But the nautilus is supposed to be the direct ancestor of the octopus. And between the nautilus and the octopus, their protein coding strategies are radically different. There's a leap qualitatively in their strategy. And I don't know everything that's going on here. I can't really explain to you what the system means. I'd have to research it. I'd have to go a deep dive into what A to I mRNA editing site isoform is. But the argument here is that fundamentally the method in which a organism codes for its proteins, that's not something that changes between a descendant and its ancestor. It's not something that changes in one lineage. That's something that it's a fundamental change that just happened billions of years ago in a very, very ancient split divergence that then creates organisms that have this method and organisms that have this method. That doesn't happen in one lineage. You can't go from nautilus to octopus and change the way proteins are coded. That's crazy talk, according to evolution. So their solution is that this radical change in quality, this radical shift is the fault of extraterrestrial retroviruses that altered the organisms. This is what causes the, quote, great leap forward. Unless all the new genes expressed in the squid/octopus lineages arose from simple mutations of existing genes in either the squid or in other organisms sharing the same habitat, there is surely no way by which this large qualitative transition can be explained by conventional neo-Darwinian processes, even if horizontal gene transfer is allowed. Horizontal gene transfer means organisms are living at the same time and they're like in the same generation, roughly speaking, and then they just transfer genes back and forth. It's very common in bacteria. But even if you allow it, that doesn't get you new protein coding strategies. It doesn't give you something fundamental. It's like a bacteria. If two bacteria can horizontally transfer genes, one bacteria can't transfer to the other bacteria. Um, um, I'm sorry. I'm gonna edit this later, but a couple raccoons just like walked past this window right here, so gotta take a break and see the raccoons. And now I'm all trying to pick up right where I left off. I literally stopped mid sentence, but one bacteria can't transfer genetic information to another bacteria and then like turn that bacteria into like from a from a it can't turn it into say a detritivore, right? That breaks down dead things from something that eats live things. It can't make a fundamental change through horizontal gene transfers. One bacteria can't turn another bacteria into something that does photosynthesis, right? Something that intrinsic, something that fundamental can't be just transferred over. So even if horizontal gene transfer is allowed, you don't get such a dramatic change under current neo-Darwinian processes. So it's the current model does not explain the octopus by any stretch of the imagination. The neo-Darwinian mechanism doesn't work for the octopus. It's an outlier, it's a challenge, it's a problem for evolution. And so this paper is going to propose something quite crazy as an explanation for the octopus. Thus, the possibility that cryopreserved squid and or octopus eggs arrived in icy bolides several 100 million years ago should not be discounted. So, squid and octopus arrived here from outer space as eggs. They came here from outer space. Octopuses and squid are extraterrestrials. We don't just have extraterrestrial bacteria living among us. We don't just have extraterrestrial viruses in our atmosphere. We have extraterrestrial organisms, multicellular animals living among us, namely the squid, the octopus, and other cephalopods. But this, of course, does not explain the octopus's difference, the difference in the octopus from other cephalopods. Why is the octopus so genetically different from those? And you remember from the last video I made, they gave us this beautiful, beautiful picture here, this graph that is just my favorite graph or image figure that I've ever seen in a scientific paper whatsoever. Squid plus virus equals octopus. Squid plus virus equals octopus. Their proposal is that squid evolved into octopus by means of genes inserted by extraterrestrial viruses. Alien squid plus alien virus equals alien octopus that lives here on Earth. And that is their proposal. Given that the complex sets of new genes in the octopus may not have come solely from horizontal gene transfers or simple random mutations of existing genes, or by simple duplicate expansions, it is then logical to surmise, given our current knowledge of the biology of comets and their debris, the new genes and their viral drivers most likely came from space. However, it is also clear that to accept such a proposition also requires that we diminish the role for highly localized Darwinian evolution on Earth, which is likely to be strongly resisted by traditional biologists. So these 33 scientists anticipate that just like creationists and just like intelligent design advocates, that mainstream traditional scientists are going to resist this idea that even though you're pointing at a very legitimate challenge to the current paradigm, scientists are going to resist this change on philosophical, ideological, political grounds, however you want to spell it out. They're going to resist that idea because they don't like it. Because it's so different. It diminishes Darwin's impact. It diminishes Darwinian evolution. It makes Darwinian evolution seem not sufficient. And I don't believe it is sufficient. And I think this paper does lay out a good argument for why it is not sufficient to explain cephalopods. How do you get the octopus? How do you get the squid? That should not of course, be of concern, as the focus of our attention for general evolutionary molecular processes now shifts to the cosmos and beyond for our immediate solar system. This evidence provides for and allows the study of cosmic gene pools, and these are capable of driving and, dare we say, controlling and thus steering biological evolution here on Earth. So, this is another reason why people are going to resist it, because if we accept that a lot of our genes, a lot of the genetic information that exists in organisms today came from outer space, then this has implications on the future of our species, the future of organisms, our evolutionary trajectory. That changes once we admit that a lot of this genetic information is not from this earth. And now we get another beautiful graph. These are phylogenetic, there's a phylogenetic tree. And if this phylogenetic tree is drawn and you try and add cephalopods to this phylogenetic tree, it doesn't actually work. So it basically says if you add cephalopods to a phylogenetic tree, you are forcing it into evolutionary precursor relationships. So it doesn't match, it doesn't work, it doesn't fit. You are forcing it. You're forcing it there simply because you want evolution to explain it. You're jamming it in there as a puzzle piece that doesn't fit, but because you want the puzzle to explain everything, you want the puzzle to be the complete picture, then you jam this piece in it to make it the complete picture, but the piece doesn't fit. Wow. That is crazy. Okay. Well, on to number 14. So cephalopods don't fit phylogenetically. They must have had extraterrestrial gene insertions from retroviruses to even explain their genetic complexity. Neo-Darwinism itself cannot explain the cephalopods. Evolutionary origin of vertebrate retroviruses. This now leads to the crux and an important take-home lesson of this review. While all viruses, when looked at closely, are exceedingly clever, the retroviruses are up there with the most sophisticated and compact of all known viruses. These viruses and their elements now appear to be important viral drivers of major evolutionary genetic change on Earth over the past few 100 million years. Okay, so here is the main crux of their argument. This is one of their longer sections, but I am going to skip over a lot of it because it gets very technical. They say they're going to get technical, but they are going to go through all of evolutionary history, and they're going to point to moments in evolution where things quickly evolve. Diversification is a dramatic event, and they're going to point to these moments and say that these parts of rapid evolution, these big diversification events, they are due to viral extraterrestrial information that is being inserted into organisms from outer space and altering their genes. And that is what drives rapid evolution in these different points in evolutionary history. So they are drivers of major evolutionary genetic change on Earth. And this has been happening over the past few hundreds of millions of years. And they have previous papers outlining that exact thing. Cell-derived reverse transcriptase activity is also a principal molecular player in adaptive somatic hypermutation of antibody genes, yada, yada, yada. So retroviruses, I'm going to pick up right here. Retroviruses can infect a wide range of animal cells, and the integrated proviruses produced can leave their trace as genomic fossils termed endogenous retroviruses. These DNA sequences are therefore relics of past and probably virulent HIV-like epidemics, whereby the survivors, and now partially immune to the immediate HIV-like variant, have genomic integrations in their germline cells, leading, as discussed, to the duplicative expansion and diversification of functional ancestral haplotype blocks. There are the haplotypes again, and there's Richard Dawkins again. So, what does all of that mean? Well, this basically is arguing that, well, once again, throughout evolutionary history, we see dramatic extinction events followed immediately by big evolutionary events where things evolve a lot faster. So evolution is kind of slow and steady. We see a lot of the same types of organisms. And then, say, like in the Permian period, big extinction event. And then the survivors of the extinction event rapidly evolve and diversify and create a bunch of new types of organisms. Now, as a creationist, I'm interpreting this in terms of flood layers, where extinction events just mean these are a lot of organisms that lived at this time, they were laid down. But I'm not talking about creationism in this video. I'm talking about evolution and this theory. So we have moments where there's big extinction events and then big rapid evolutionary processes taking over immediately after the extinction event. Their proposal is that basically these retroviruses, which again are viruses that impact the genetics of the creature they're infecting, retroviruses spread throughout nature. They come down from outer space. They're seeded from outer space. Then they infect organisms. They spread across the globe. They wipe out giant numbers of organisms, creating ginormous extinction events. And then some organisms develop immunity to these viruses and they survive. And then they also have new traits and new genes from these retroviruses that let them evolve and spread from there. So this pattern in the fossil record that has largely been incorporated into neo-Darwinism, this pattern of extinction and then rapid evolution, dramatic evolution, this pattern is explained by viruses from outer space that land, infect creatures, alter their DNA, give them new traits. They wipe out most of the creatures, but the ones that survive with immunity now have altered DNA that help them adapt and evolve. How about that? And so they take a look at specific areas. There are lineages of retroviruses. Oh, and there's actually really good evidence for this. I have to admit, there's a really good argument they make here that I'm highlighting right now. So they point to retroviruses that infect organisms that haven't evolved yet. So there's a retroviral lineage that appears, therefore, to have an ancient marine origin, which originated together with, if not before, their jawed vertebrate hosts. So, for instance, these retroviruses, basically, they infect jawed vertebrates, but they appear in the fossil record at the same time as, or even before, their hosts. So how can a virus evolve to infect a creature that hasn't evolved yet? How amazing is that? So their proposal, this is great evidence for their theory, I must say. Their proposal is that the virus actually exists before the creature that it infects. The genetic information for jawed vertebrates, some of it, existed in the viruses before the jawed vertebrates. And then the virus helps bring about the jawed vertebrates and then infects those creatures. That is pretty remarkable. This is a very important result, and the authors conclude our analyses provide evidence both phylogenetically and temporally that retroviruses emerged together with their vertebrate hosts in the ocean over 460 to 550 million years ago in the early Paleozoic era, if not earlier. So not just in this example of vertebrate hosts, but all basically, largely speaking, retroviruses that infect organisms appear at the same time as those organisms in the fossil record, if not before. There's no period of time where the organisms live and then viruses evolve to infect those organisms. No, the viruses existed at the same time, immediately with those organisms, and maybe even before the organisms that they infect. That is pretty remarkable if that's true, and I have no reason to believe it's not. They cite a paper here from 2017. So this, of course, dates the sophisticated viral gene vectors and their associated gene manipulative evolutionary driver effects to just at or before the Cambrian explosion. And that's why this whole paper is named after the Cambrian explosion, because it kind of demonstrates their theory. Viruses with complex genes, lots of genetic information, They appear in the fossil record alongside the organisms they infect. They don't evolve after these organisms. They appear at the same time or even before. Now, from a creationist perspective, viruses appear living at the same time. Like that's fine. You can even have viruses existing slightly before, not before, but like fossil record speaking, geological record speaking. You can have viruses um, living or being deposited immediately beneath the organisms they infect because in the flood, everything's living at the same time in the flood. All flood layers of organisms are living at the same time 4,500 years ago. So it doesn't matter really where those viruses appear in the fossil record. They could appear anywhere, and that would be fine. So it's okay for viruses to appear. It's a little odd that they appear a little bit before the organisms they infect, if only that they'd be living in a place where their hosts are not living. But that's just me going off of this paper. I haven't done research in that at all. I would love to hear a creationist who knows his virology, I guess like a Joe Francis. I would need Joe Francis to break that down for me and see if I'm thinking on the right track. Maybe I'm not thinking about the right things there. But what I do know is that this paper is proposing that because complex viruses appear in the fossil record with their organisms, or even before their organisms, then they are extraterrestrial in origin and they are actually drivers of the Cambrian explosion. Certainly, they are emerging before the later evolutionary appearance of the far more complex animal and plant species now extant on Earth. In other words, we can now make the plausible scientific argument that a key feature of information-dense genetic systems to make more complex organisms was already here on Earth before the actual emergence of subsequent greater terrestrial complexity. So the ability to be complex existed in viruses before creatures evolved to be complex. Viruses had all the material that you need to evolve quickly to become more complex. They had it all there on Earth before these organisms even evolved, and therefore extraterrestrial viruses are the reason for the Cambrian explosion, according to this paper. This is a contradiction if we consider our just discussed viewpoint that all viruses, in particular the retroviruses, are a reflection and a microcosm of the host genetic regulatory it's going to be makeup. Where's the makeup? That is a type of compressed module of genetic information in touch with the whole of the cell's variability to grow and divide to produce progeny cells and to evolve. So it doesn't make sense in the neo-Darwinian viewpoint to have retroviruses that exist, that appear at the same time or even earlier than the organisms that they infect. That doesn't fit with the current model. That's a contradiction. It just is. You can't have all of this information, all of this genetic stuff. You can't just have it there at the same time. It doesn't work that way. You need the viruses to evolve alongside the organisms. Number 15. Almost there, guys. Almost there. Cambrian explosion. It is well known that a mass extinction event or events occurred at the end of the Ediacaran. I have never actually spoken that word out loud. I'm guessing that's the rock layer right below the Cambrian. It is well known that a mass extinction event or events occurred at the end of the Ediacaran period about 542 million years ago. This was the immediate forerunner of the Cambrian explosion. So it's the layer that exists in the Cambrian right before the Cambrian explosion, is what I'm gathering. The mass extinction scale suggests the passage of our solar system through a giant molecular cloud, dislodging multiple long-period Oort cloud comets into the inner solar system, setting up impacts with Earth. So they have a cosmological explanation here. The Oort cloud is a mysterious place out in the solar system that supplies comets to our solar system, because comets only have a certain lifetime. They can only exist for a certain amount of time. And so if the universe is billions of years old, we shouldn't have any comets left because all the comets should have disappeared. So scientists propose an Oort cloud that exists out there somewhere, and it supplies comets to our solar system. So 542 million years ago, the basically our solar system passed through a giant molecular cloud, which dislodged lots of comets. It sent these comets into our solar system and sent them on a collision course with Earth. I feel like that takes a lot of imagination. But they say it takes little imagination to consider that the Precambrian mass extinction event was correlated with the impact of a giant life bearing comet or comets. So during this period, our solar system goes through a giant cloud in space, dislodges lots of comets hit the Earth, and causes this extinction event during the Cambrian timeline. But it also corresponds with the seeding of Earth with new cosmic derived cellular organisms and viral genes. So not only do these comets wipe out the organisms that are in the Cambrian layers, but they also seeded new living materials that then evolved and explained the next layer in the Cambrian, namely the Cambrian explosion, which includes most of the major animal groups. There may indeed have been a complex comet debris stream implying multiple impacts over the estimated 25 million years at the start of the Cambrian explosion. So we're just getting pelted with comets for 25 million years at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion. We're pelted, extinction event on Earth, but they also bring with them viral genes. So genes, genetic information, complex genetic information contained in viruses from outer space that are now going to drive evolution from here on out. It's a pretty elaborate theory. I got to hand it to these guys. It's an elaborate model. The Precambrian impact event is not unique. There is other evidence for the coincidence of cosmic bolide impacts at mass extinction event diversification boundaries. And I knew where they were going with this. There are other parts in the fossil record where a big extinction event happens and then a dramatic evolution event immediately follows it. And I've already talked about the one they're about to bring up, which is the KPG boundary or the KT boundary, which occurred 65 million years ago, actually 66 technically, that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs and the rise of small mammals. That's the one I brought up earlier as an example because it's a very famous example. But you also have one 26 million years ago where comets coincided with a mass extinction event and another diversification. I'm not as familiar with that one. It's not as well known. The exotic amino acids in the KT boundary, rocks and the rise of microfungi are also indicative of novel genetic material arriving at the impact. So this is another time there's a big extinction event, and then there were new amino acids, new genetic information, and microfungi appear. Microfungi. Not very familiar with microfungi, but I'll have to do research on that sometime. In this regard, they point out that foraminifera algae coevolution from this guy, Martin Brazier, could be interpreted from a cosmic perspective. So they're pointing to other papers now that show that could be explained by their panspermia model. Okay. It goes without saying that tardigrades, microsegmented, tiny eukaryotic animals which emerged in the Cambrian period, pose a significant challenge to traditional neo-Darwinian thinking. So they've moved on to tardigrades. They are a challenge, according to this paper, to neo-Darwinian thinking. They don't fit the evolutionary timeline. This is a creation talking point part 4. Creation talking point part 4. Tardigrades do not make sense in evolution. Because they seem so well adapted to living in space, why would an organism evolve to live in space if it evolved on Earth? Why would it do that? It's basically like an organism that is evolving on land. Let's say they're evolving in the state of Illinois. New organism appears in the state of Illinois. Terrestrial, four-legged. Let's say it's like I don't know, whatever it is. You make it up. You make up a creature. It evolves in the state of Indiana. And then suddenly it evolves traits that allow it to breathe underwater. It develops what's it called? I've been doing this for so long. I'm forgetting the system, but it develops the kidneys and the nephrons that basically. Oh, what is this process called? It pees very Osmoregulation. It evolves osmoregulation to live in the ocean, right? Where it pees very diluted urine because it's trying to, not diluted, the opposite of diluted. It's peeing very, very concentrated urine with lots and lots of ions in it because it's adapted to living in salt water where it's constantly obtaining salt and ions from its environment. And therefore, when it urinates, it gets rid of lots of ions too. So that's why freshwater fish and saltwater fish have different osmoregulation. So imagine a creature, you make it up, it's evolving in the state of Indiana, no saltwater, no ocean in sight, and it just evolves the ability to swim, to breathe in water, to osmoregulate in salt water in the state of Indiana. That makes no sense. There's no selective pressures for it whatsoever. Why is it evolving the ability to live in the ocean? Well, likewise, why in the world would a tardigrade, which lives perfectly fine on Earth, why would it evolve the ability to live in the vacuum of space? Where does it go on planet Earth that is just like the vacuum of space? Where? There's nowhere on Earth that is literally the vacuum of space, but it can live in the vacuum of space and do just fine. Now, special creation kind of explains this. God created a creature that is so adaptable to environments that it can survive outer space. But neo-Darwinism cannot explain it. Makes no sense to neo-Darwinism. And panspermia honestly probably explains it best. Not saying it's true. Not saying a tardigrade came from outer space. But that idea at least makes evolutionary sense. It makes scientific sense that it transported here from outer space and it has just retained the ability to live in outer space. It already had those genes. It evolved those genes in space, and then it maintains them while it is here. So tardigrades fit panspermia. They do not fit neo-Darwinism, and they're pretty neutral to creationism. So they're a win for panspermia, neutral to creationism, and a negative for the theory of neo-Darwinism. And then they talk about more things that can survive in outer space. Same argument goes for them. 2 species of algae can survive 16 months on the International Space Station in the vacuum of space. Holy cow. And of course, bacteria spores can do this and some other things. Almost there. Number 16, implications of Cambrian explosion and retroviral data. Before the extensive sequencing of DNA became available, it would have been reasonable to speculate that random copying errors in a gene sequence could, over time, lead to the emergence of new traits, body plans, and new physiologies that could explain the whole of evolution. However, the data we have reviewed here challenge this point of view. It suggests that the Cambrian explosion of multicellular life that occurred 500 million years ago led to a sudden emergence of essentially all the genes that subsequently came to be arranged into an exceedingly wide range of multicellular life forms. Tardigrades, the squid, octopus, fruit flies, humans, to name but a few. Okay, this is a clarification of their argument. It's much more of a, they're explaining their argument more clearly and narrowing it down so that if you respond to it, you need to read this paragraph. This is why if you're a creationist and you want to refute papers in science, you can't just read the science.com or Smithsonian summary of the paper. You have to read the actual paper to respond to it. You can't just base off of the summary because this paragraph actually explains the argument refinedly. Refinedly? It's a refined explanation of the argument. You can see me losing energy and being drained as time goes on, but I need to explain this. So in this paragraph, they are refining their argument. They are not saying that evolution cannot ever explain all the stuff that they're talking about. The evolution of the traits that get you survival in space. The dramatic traits that we see in the squid and the octopus that doesn't fit anything else. Evolution can kind of maybe explain those. If you were just going off of evolution theory, you can imagine logically that over billions of years through mutations and natural selection and genes getting scrambled up, and all the mechanisms that we know of today, you can imagine a world in which these traits evolve. So they're not saying evolution can explain it. What they're saying is that, it could happen if given enough time. But all of this happened during the Cambrian explosion. So like if all this, if you could look in the fossil record and you can see the evolution of tardigrades step by step by step by step, fine. Like you explain it. Maybe it's weird that they can survive in space, but you could study it and find out why they got the traits they did. You can do the same thing with the squid and the octopus. How did the squid get complex eyes and a complex nervous system and the ability to change its appearance and squeeze into places and change its body size and shape? You can explain that if you looked in the fossil record and there was a slow evolution and you could see it throughout the fossil record. But the squid, the octopus, the tardigrade, the fruit flies, they all appear suddenly. And most of these things are in the Cambrian explosion, which is 500 million years ago, which is way before everything else evolved. No precursors, they just appear there. And that is the argument. That's what takes a miracle. That's when they said miracle, right? They didn't say miracle to mean it can't happen at all. They meant miracle to say the Cambrian explosion refutes neo-Darwinism because it takes a theory that works if given this much time and shrinks it down to this much time and says it had to happen this suddenly. That is what doesn't work with neo-Darwinism. So this is why I'm spending hours on this paper so that I have a summary of it. That's fine. You can summarize papers and give people the gist of it. But if you really want to refute an idea or dive into an idea or understand an idea, it takes this work. It takes diving in, reading it line by line, word by word, and understanding the actual argument being made. Because I guarantee that a creationist or an intelligent design advocate or even an evolutionist could take this paper. An evolutionist who doesn't like panspermia, they can take this paper, they can read the abstract, they can read papers about this paper, and they will say, your claim is that evolution can't explain this, but evolution can explain it by this way. If you give it this much time, if you do this, if you get this kind of mutation, we can explain it too. But they're not actually responding to the argument because we got all the way down to number 16, and number 16 is where they really refine the argument and put it in the correct perspective, in its most steel-manned position. This is the position right here. It's this paragraph. And if I didn't read through the whole paper, if I didn't make this video and go spend hours breaking it down, we never would have gotten that context. The expression of an entire new suite of retroviral genes of presumed external origin appears to have taken place mainly via genomic rearrangements that followed ERV integrations. That's the retroviruses. This was precisely the logic of evolution proposed by the late Sir Fred Hoyle and one of us, there's that guy again, NCW, when I'm just going to call him NCW because I can't say his last name, as far back as 1981. It was argued that copying errors of existing genes could not, on the average, produce new genes with functional utility. This gets crazy. By analogy, why does it keep doing that? By analogy with computer programming, it was pointed out that errors generated in copying computer code could not lead to enhanced or new capabilities, but overwhelmingly to degradation of the original program. What? They literally are pointing out that mutations in DNA, by analogy to computer programming, scrambling things up by accident only degrades the information. It does not add new information and make things better. That, my friends, is creationist talking point number 5. And that is a huge creationist talking point. And by the way, I don't even like that talking point. That's a creationist talking point I don't even use because I've seen places where mutations have actually been a net positive. There are lots of ways that mutations can be a strength to a species, can help a species adapt to its environment and things like that. The reason human beings can drink milk, for example, is because there have been 5 mutations that happen in the gene that regulates our lactase, which is an enzyme that breaks down lactose. The genes that regulate lactase needed mutations, and now it can digest milk past the age of 3, right? Whereas before, and still most humans still can't digest milk well because their genes don't have those mutations. There are positive mutations. I don't like the creationist talking point that mutations only degrade and only bring things downhill. I don't use that argument. But that argument is being made here by 33 evolutionary scientists. And even though I don't use that argument, I do believe that mutations aren't enough to explain all of evolution because as mutations build up, yes, you get some positive things that help things adapt, but the, that mutation rate is so fast that the bad mutations build up before the good mutations can really take over. So even though it works here and there with good mutations, um, and new information can be added, even though it works in some places, I don't think it's enough to explain to help neo-Darwinism. I don't think it explains all evolution. So anyway, all that to say, they are bringing up creationist talking point number five. Number five. It was argued, therefore, that new genes for evolution must logically be supplied by the ingress of extraterrestrial virions and other microorganisms. So their only alternative to neo-Darwinism has to be extraterrestrial viruses changing the genes of organisms. All right, three more. Hang with me, guys. Three more, 17, 18, and 19. Number 17, cosmic biology and the rise of mankind. Here are our guys, Fred Hoyle and Wickramasinghe. Thus argued. Oh no, I hit the source again. They argued and predicted on the basis of the then available evidence, as well as the species mass extinction record and astronomical infrared spectra on interstellar and cometary bodies, and more recently on the known periodic cratering and comet impact records that microorganisms and virus populations in the comets and related cosmic bolides appear to have regularly delivered living systems, organisms, viruses, and seeds to the Earth since its formation, and continue to do so. So basically, throughout all of Earth history, living things have been dropped onto Earth from outer space. And they did it even before Earth became habitable for life. But of course, they can't survive on Earth until Earth is a hospitable place. So they've been delivered throughout all of Earth's history. And once Earth became hospitable, then they started to survive their impacts. This is a plausible explanation as to why Cambrian-like explosions did not occur in the previous 3,500 million years prior to the 500 million year ago Cambrian explosion. So organisms, even so, it's like, what are the odds that for billions of years living organisms were deposited on Earth? They weren't deposited on Earth, and then suddenly they do in the Cambrian layer. Well, that's not what they're claiming. They're claiming organisms have always been being deposited on Earth from elsewhere in the universe. They just finally were able to survive when Earth became hospitable. Now, that begs the question, how long ago did life evolve? I mean, if life evolving takes a long time, where, like, the Earth is 4 point something billion years old? I guess the universe is 13 billion years. So I guess planets and comets. Oh, I turned off my mic. Or I just turned on my mic. Crap. So I'm just not sure when life supposedly evolved. You have 13 billion years of universe history. I guess you need a comet or a planet to evolve faster than Earth before Earth does, and then life evolves there and then gets deposited for the last it gets like landed on Earth for the past 4 billion years. I mean, okay. That seems to be pretty it's a little out there, but at least they admit it and they provided a pretty good paper here to explain their viewpoint. So the evidence consistent with the HW cosmic biology viewpoint has grown both in quantity and strength over the past decade. All right, let's go down to 18. They just give you some more evidence of things dropping on Earth and talking about the flaws in Darwinian evolution. Number 18, the cause of epidemics and pandemics, a new virology principle. So now in this section, they're going to propose that viruses that they're pointing out that viruses appear suddenly and spread among human populations. So HIV and AIDS being one of them, um, the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918 was devastating and equally unexpected. So they're unexpected viruses. They appear suddenly, they wipe out huge numbers of the human population, and then we don't know where they come from. They just appear there. So the idea is that viruses are constantly being pelted on Earth. They're dropping here over and over and over again for millions and millions of years, and every now and then a virus lands that can infect humans, and that's how a virus gets started, spreads, and then humans have to develop immunity to that virus. And that kind of explains the cycle of pandemics among humans. So, and by the way, I know as I'm talking about viruses spreading among humans, it's hard not to think of COVID-19. Remember, this paragraph, this article is from 2018, which is a year and a half really before COVID hit. So they didn't even know about COVID, and they're talking about how viruses appear suddenly, spread among the population. So maybe it wasn't bats. Maybe it was aliens. An all-pervasive cosmic biology means that many novel emergent disease-carrying microorganisms. I'm sorry, I'm speaking too fast. I'm just trying to get to the end of this. An all-pervasive cosmic biology means that many novel emergent disease-causing microorganisms and viruses will show phylogenetic relationships with existing viral species and genera, as we are now considering a cosmic gene pool under this viewpoint. We should then assume, as one first reactive response, they have come from space, even if there are also plausible alternative terrestrial explanations of first cause, i.e., the cosmic cause should be part of the possible fix of causative explanations to be ruled either in or out. So basically, they would expect these viruses to be able to be structured in a phylogenetic tree because they're all coming from outer space. They're all related. They're just landing at different times, infecting people at different times, and they should be able to fit on a phylogenetic tree. And so if you put them together in a phylogenetic tree, that could be explained by extraterrestrial evolution or terrestrial evolution. They're both viruses, all belong in a family tree and can be explained that way. All right, last one, number 19. We have made it. Number 19. In our considered view, mankind is now entering a historic paradigm shifting moment in both our understanding of the evolution of life on Earth and the origins of the many pandemics that have exacted huge tolls on mankind in the recent past and the even recenter past. Indeed, all of us have contributed directly as co-authors of this paper because, in our considered opinion, in confronting the wide range of scientific data, all the scientific and societal evidence seemingly points in one direction, in all-pervasive cosmic biology, mediated mainly by cometary transfers, being a driver for life on Earth. We believe the signs of this change are now so apparent that one of the biggest backflips in the history of science is now on our doorstep. One of the biggest backflips. This is akin to the cosmological scientific revolution of heliocentrism, the Darwinian revolution, the germ theory revolution, any revolution you can imagine in science. This is like one of those. We are now going from a terrestrial model of origins to an extraterrestrial model of origins that explains data from a wide range of models that must be encompassed together in one global cosmic model. If you think that our position here is far-fetched or even alarmist, we quote the late great Cornell professor Thomas Gold, a far-sighted and creative astronomer and geophysicist who observed closely many scientific backflips in his long career, the most notable being in the geosciences, which is the theory of continental drift. That's another backflip. Continental drift. Everybody laughed at it. They said, how could the continents be moving around? That's insane. And then that turned out to happen. So there's another backflip. And this guy who writes a lot about scientific backflips, Tom Gold, wrote, what does the refereeing procedure really look like? How does it really go on? If, for example, an application was made in the early 60s or late 50s suggesting that the person wanted to investigate the possibility that continents are moving around a little, it would have been ruled out absolutely instantly without questions. That was crackpot stuff and had long been thought dead. Wegener, of course, was an absolute crackpot, and everybody knew that you wouldn't have any chance. 6 years later, you could not get a paper published that doubted continental drift. The herd had swung around, but it was still a firm and arrogant herd. So this goes back to something that's just about the nature of scientists. Scientists are like this. Scientists, they are they are hard people to be around. They're arrogant. They are stuck on certain ideas. They don't like certain ideas. They kick them out. I've been criticized at presenting as science papers because people don't like the ideas I'm presenting. They shoot it down. Scientists can be like that. They're firm and arrogant. I mean, that's what they're like. So it's very hard to convince a large number of scientists that you are correct if you're trying to change around their models. And they might argue that that's a good thing because you don't want to accept something unless there's so clear evidence that even the most hard-hearted scientist comes around to it. But this guy's pointing out that maybe scientists have to open up their minds a little bit because if they weren't so hard-hearted, maybe they would come to the truth sooner. Maybe they wouldn't have to go through the step of you're an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about, you're a fool, and you're a goofball crackpot. Maybe if they're a little more open-minded, they would actually look at the evidence that the person's presenting a little deeper and see that it's not all crazy. And that's what I'm trying to do here. I mean, I don't think panspermia is true. I'm a Christian, I'm a creationist. I don't think life evolved elsewhere and then came here. But I'm trying to kind of have that open mind and look at it objectively. And objectively speaking, if I'm an evolutionist, if I were an evolutionist, I would strongly, strongly consider this paper. They bring up some very good critiques of the mainstream evolutionary view, and their alternative perspective does answer a lot of questions that I would have about evolution. And then they talk about other things that were denied in science. Meteorites were denied in the 1700s. People rejected eyewitness accounts of meteorites falling from the sky. And then, of course, that was proven true. So they're trying to put themselves on that same footing. I don't think they believe that they are at that level yet. They're not like panspermia is not as well proven as continental drift or meteorites, obviously. But they're not saying because they were right, we are right. They're just saying we might not be wrong and don't write us off because people have been written off before in the history of science. And the best approach really isn't to just dismiss views you don't like, it's to look at the evidence. And then they encourage future research. They summarize the whole idea here. They talk about the Copernican revolution too. They are throwing all the shots, everything from the history of science, of people who were rejected, called a fool, called crazy, maybe even banned from church, which did happen. They just bring out all those examples and say, we've had paradigm shifts before. People have not liked ideas simply because of prejudice or bias, and then have proven to be wrong. And we should be open-minded. So at the end, that's number 19. We are finished up with this paper. I had a good time there, even though this is the longest I've done this. I know some people, their full-time jobs is just to stream for like hours and hours. They're on here talking, and I can't do that. This is the closest I'll probably ever get to that. But I'm glad I went through this paper in depth. Hopefully you got something from this. You can read this paper yourself. It's a fascinating paper. Again, I think their criticisms of neo-Darwinism are correct. I think if you are a neo-Darwinist, you have to consider this line of thinking. They're pretty much correct on this whole last section. There were lots of people who proposed crazy ideas, and everyone thought they were crazy, and then they turned out to be right. And this is all there. So, yeah, I'm glad I went through that. Neo-Darwinism has not explained everything. There are some gaping holes in it. I don't think it's a true theory or model. And I'm a creationist, so there's some things in here that's useful to me. I don't think life came from outer space. So it's interesting. There are biological materials in outer space. And I won't rule out that maybe God created organisms on other planets. He could have created microscopic organisms elsewhere, but we do know that he created life here. We do know that. So I suppose a purely viral idea of panspermia, that viruses from outer space landing on here causing diseases, causing epidemics, that's not really out of the question. There's nothing in scripture that says our illnesses came from here. So viruses coming from outer space is not really out of the question. So that could be something we consider as creationists. We could consider that, incorporating that into our model. We have to believe in rapid evolutionary processes. We believe in really, really quick adaptation to the millionth percentile, like faster than what evolutionists believe. So there's some crazy things that creationists have to believe in as well. And so maybe extraterrestrial retroviruses has something to do with that. We'll have to wait and see. One more thing I want to point out before I close out. I'm not going to go through the appendices, but there's a really, really cool quote here. They quote lots of their authors directly. So sometimes their individual authors like point out certain things and they just quote their individual author. They say, we all don't think this, but this guy thinks this. And one of those cases down here, this is what I'll end with. One of us, BK, Burger King thinks that, quote, the complexity and sophistication of life cannot originate from non-biological matter under any scenario over any expanse of space and time, however vast. If this were to be so, then supernatural intervention or intelligence would be required following a standard Big Bang. And then they even quote Wickramasinghe, guys and everything. They have his paper there. So BK, one of their authors, let me find him. Call him out by name. Put his initials in there, so he's got to own it. Let's find BK. Where is he? Try and find him before I do. BK. You probably beat me. Here he is. Brig Kleiss. So Brig Kleiss thinks that no way, no matter what conditions you have, no matter how much time you give it, any planet, you put it in the best conditions possible. You give it an eternity to work with, hundreds of billions of billions and billions of years. You will never get a single cell evolving from non-living materials, ever. It doesn't matter. Under any scenario, under any expanse of space and time, you are not getting a cell from non-biological matter. If this were to be so, then supernatural intervention. You read that right. It's in this paper. They finally got to it, right? I kept talking about how they talk about Lamarckianism, they talk about panspermia, they talk about crazy ideas, and I was like, they're sounding like creationists in the way they're trying to defend themselves and saying, yeah, you all think this is crazy, but it might be true. Intelligent design has made an appearance in this paper too. If it is true that life cannot originate from non-biological matter, no matter what happens, no matter how much time, space, or perfect conditions you give it, then supernatural intervention, intelligent design would be required following the standard Big Bang. Wow. So there you go. The 33 scientists, they believe neo-Darwinism is not the full story, not the full picture. It doesn't work in a lot of ways. Cephalopods, Cambrian explosion, viruses, you name it. They don't think that neo-Darwinism explains it. Their explanation has some merit. We'll have to see where it goes. We'll have to see what more evidence they find in the future. But they believe that it came from outer space, which is a pretty good movie. Came from outer space. So go watch that now to relax your brain from this in-depth review of this paper. But yeah, one of the 33, believes in intelligent design. So good on him, and way to get this paper published. That's my review on Panspermia. Hope you covered the whole paper. Thanks for being with me for these few hours, and go watch It Came from Outer Space. I will see you next time on the Creation Reformation YouTube channel. This is Jake Ramgren. See you next time.